His name was Dorian Vell, the king's fourth son, last in line for the throne, the weakest of all who bore the Vell surname. In the kingdom of Ashenmore, every heir underwent the circle trials on their 16th birthday. The first circle of power meant you were capable of fighting. The third circle meant you were worthy of command. The fifth circle meant you could claim the throne. Dorian failed every single one. His body couldn't even withstand the initial surge of mana. The healers examined him 3 times. Each time, the verdict was the same. The channels are empty. The core is not formed. His potential is on par with that of a peasant child. The king listened to the report while standing by the window of the throne room. He did not turn around. He simply nodded and ordered the chancellor to find a role for his fourth son. A role was found quickly. The Sarath trading house from the eastern lands proposed a marriage alliance. The head of the house wished to form a kinship with the crown. The crown wished to gain access to the Sarath iron mines without military conflict. The bride was the head of the house's youngest daughter. Her name was Lyriel Sarath. She was 17. She wielded third circle ice magic. By the standards of the Eastern lands, this was an outstanding achievement for her age. By the standards of the Ashenmore royal court, it was enough to be considered a useful asset. Dorian learned of the engagement 3 days before the ceremony. It wasn't his father or the chancellor who told him. It was a servant who brought a new suit for him to try on. The servant said the ceremony was scheduled for the morning of the 4th day and that the prince should look dignified. Dorian looked at the suit, dark blue velvet with silver embroidery of the House of Vell. He ran his fingers over the fabric and said nothing. That evening, he sat in the palace library. It was the only place where he was left alone. His older brothers occupied the training halls and hunting grounds. Dorian occupied a dusty corner between the shelves of historical chronicles. He was reading an entry about the first king of Ashenmore. It stated that Aldrich Vell I had united the 7 houses not by the sword nor by magic. He united them through marriage. Each wife brought him not only lands, but also power. The chronicle described this vaguely. The power came through the union. The nature of this power had been lost. Dorian was rereading this passage for the 4th time in the last month. He didn't believe it was just a metaphor. The details were too specific. The exact dates, the names of each wife, and a description of exactly what gift she brought. The first wife gave him fire. The second gave him earth. The third gave him a voice that commanded beasts. If this were a metaphor, the author of the chronicle would not have listed the gifts in strict order, specifying the day each one manifested. The morning of the 4th day dawned with a cold wind from the east. The Sarath delegation had arrived the day before. 32 people, guards, advisors, servants, and Lyriel herself. Dorian had seen her from the library window as she stepped down from the carriage. White hair, a straight back, an expressionless face. She didn't look happy. She didn't look unhappy. She looked like someone who had long since stopped wasting emotions on things she couldn't change. The ceremony took place in the Hall of Roots. It was the oldest room in the palace. Stone walls covered in moss. The floor was made of rough-hewn granite. In the center of the hall stood a stone slab the size of a dining table. Carved into it were symbols that none of the court mages could read. Chancellor Harwin presided over the ceremony. He read the terms of the alliance in a monotone voice. The Sarath iron mines were to come under joint management. Lyriel Sarath was to receive the title of Princess Consort. Dorian Vell was to receive a wife and a formal promotion in status, rising from 4th in line to heir to the position of administrator of the Eastern Trade Corridor. It sounded impressive. In reality, it meant he was being sent far away from the capital with a minimal budget and no military support. His older brother, Renval, stood by the wall of the hall, his arms crossed over his chest. A slight smirk. Renval had passed the seventh circle of power at 19. He was the heir to the throne and knew it with absolute certainty. The fourth brother was marrying a merchant's daughter. To Renval, this was confirmation of the natural order of things. The weak get what they deserve. Dorian and Lyriel stood on opposite sides of the stone slab. The Chancellor handed each of them a ritual knife. Tradition required that both make an incision in their palms and touch the stone at the same time. Blood on the ancient stone, a symbol of the union of the two houses. Dorian took the knife. The blade was dull with age. He ran it across his palm and felt a faint prick. Blood seeped out slowly. A few drops fell onto the gray stone. Lyriel did the same from the other side. Her blood was paler, almost transparent, a sign of ice magic in her blood. Two lines of blood flowed along the grooves carved into the stone. They moved toward each other. The Chancellor continued to recite the closing incantation. No one paid any attention to the stone. It was a formality. This ritual had been performed hundreds of times. Nothing ever happened. But Dorian was staring at the stone. He couldn't look away. The two lines of blood met at the center of the slab, at the point where the carved symbols intersected. And the moment they touched, Dorian felt something inside his chest burst. It didn't hurt. It wasn't sudden. It was more as if a wall that had stood his entire life had suddenly dissolved. And behind it lay a space whose existence he hadn't even suspected. A voice sounded in his head, not mechanical, not human, something in between. Ancient. The Union system has been activated. The first pact has been sealed. The Allies' talent has been recognized. Ice magic, third circle, cloning complete. Initial multiplier, 4. Current talent level of the host, third circle multiplied by 4, equivalent to the 12th circle. Limitation. The host's physical body is unable to withstand the full load. Accessible ceiling, 6th circle. To unlock full potential, the body must be strengthened. Recommendation. Accumulate resonance points through interaction with an ally. Dorian didn't waver. He didn't flinch. He stood motionless, staring at his hands. Cold. A distinct, icy cold pulsed through his palms. Not from the outside, from the inside. It was a sensation he had never experienced in his life. Mana. For the first time in his life, he felt mana. And not just mana. Ice. Pure, controlled ice. Chancellor Harwin finished the spell and looked up. He noticed that Dorian was standing too still. Something in his posture had changed. Something elusive. The boy who had always slumped and stared at the floor was now standing up straight. His eyes were not fixed on the stone or on his bride. They were fixed on his own palms. And in those eyes was something Harwin had never seen before. Understanding. Renval noticed it too. His smirk hadn't faded, but it had become slightly less confident. His younger brother looked different, if only for a second. But Renval was a warrior of the 7th circle. He knew how to spot changes. Lyriel was looking at Dorian from the opposite side of the stone. She, too, had sensed something. When their blood mingled on the stone, her breath caught for a moment. It was as if part of her power had leaked away through an invisible channel. She checked her inner flow. Everything was in place, nothing was missing, but the sensation lingered. The ceremony was over. The guests made their way to the banquet hall. Dorian walked beside Lyriel. He was silent. She was silent too. As they exited the Hall of Roots, Renval stopped them. He placed his hand on Dorian's shoulder, heavily, with force. He said he hoped his younger brother would be a worthy husband to his Eastern bride. He said this with a smile. The word worthy sounded like a mockery. Dorian looked at Rinval's hand on his shoulder. Then he looked his brother in the eyes. And for the first time in his life, he didn't look away. He said he thanked his brother for his kind words. His voice was steady, calm, without defiance. But something in it had changed. The tone had deepened, more confident. Rinval withdrew his hand, not because he sensed a threat, but because, for the first time, his fourth brother hadn't reacted like a victim. It was unusual, and it was unpleasant. Meanwhile, Dorian walked down the palace corridor, and with every step, a thin layer of frost cracked on the stone floor. Dorian spent the next 3 days in silence. He did not leave his assigned quarters unless necessary. He ate in his room. He read in his room. He slept little. He spent most of his time trying to understand the limits of what he had received. The Union system answered his inner questions. Not always, not everything, but enough for him to form a picture. The talent copied through the pact belonged to him forever. Lyriel lost nothing. A copy of her ice magic had integrated into his empty channels just as water fills an empty vessel. The multiplier of 4 meant that his potential in this talent was 4 times greater than that of the source. But his body limited his access. Currently, the 6th circle was available to him. To unlock the full 12th circle, he needed to strengthen his physical form. Resonance points accumulated through interaction with his ally, joint training, joint decisions, overcoming difficulties together. The deeper the genuine connection, the faster the accumulation rate. His current resonance with Lyriel stood at 7 points. 50 were required for the first physical enhancement. On the 3rd night, Dorian stepped out into the inner courtyard. It was well past midnight. Guards were patrolling the outer walls. The inner courtyard was empty. He stood in the center of the paved area and raised his right hand. The cold came instantly, not like a gust of wind, like a command carried out without delay. The air around his palm thickened. Ice crystals began to form directly from the moisture in the air. 3 seconds later, he held an ice needle 30 centimeters long in his hand. Solid, transparent, sharp as a stiletto. Dorian looked at it. Then he clenched his fist. The needle shattered into fine dust. He did it again, faster this time. The second needle formed in 2 seconds, the third in 1.5. By the 5th attempt, he could create an icy blade in the blink of an eye. His control was perfect. Ice magic obeyed him as if he'd mastered it his whole life. The system explained. A copied talent comes with a complete set of muscle memory and instinctive understanding. The recipient doesn't start from scratch. They receive a ready-made skill at the source level, multiplied by the pact's coefficient. This meant that Dorian was more skilled at ice magic than Lyriel, 4 times more skilled, even though she had been training since childhood. He returned to his chambers and found that Lyriel was awake. She was sitting on the bed, looking at him. She said she'd seen him from the window. Dorian didn't deny it. He sat down across from her and told her. Not everything, but enough. He told her that the ritual in the Hall of Roots was more than just a symbol, that the stone slab was an artifact of the first king, that through the blood bond he had received a copy of her magic, that she hadn't lost anything, that he could prove it. Lyriel listened in silence. Her face betrayed no emotion. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she asked why he had told her. Dorian replied that it was because the system says that power grows through a genuine connection, not through deception, and because she deserved to know what she had been drawn into. Lyriel looked at her hands, then at him. She said that in the House of Sarath, she too had been considered a tool, the youngest daughter, useful but not valuable. She said that if what he was saying was true, then for the first time in a long time, she had a reason to be interested. The system reacted. The resonance with Lyriel increased by 4 points. Current level, 11 out of 50. The next morning, Dorian received an official order from Chancellor Harwin. He was instructed to depart for the east within 10 days. The city of Varath, on the border of the Sarath territory, would be his residence. The budget was minimal. His security detail consisted of 20 soldiers, none of whom were above the second circle. Dorian read the order and neatly folded it. He wasn't surprised. It was to be expected. They were sending him to die in the wilderness. Not literally, but a career as governor of the Eastern Corridor without money or people meant a slow descent into political oblivion. In a year, he would be forgotten. In 3 years, his territory would be quietly handed over to one of Renval's confidants. In 5 years, his name would be mentioned only in the footnotes of court chronicles. That's what Chancellor Harwin thought. That's what Renval thought. That's what the king thought. They were all wrong. Dorian began preparing for his departure, but not in the way they expected. Instead of packing his belongings, he was gathering information. He spent 3 days in the library studying everything related to the city of Varath and the Eastern Territories. Varath was a trading hub between Ashenmoor and 2 neighboring kingdoms. Caravans carrying iron, copper, and rare minerals from the Sarath mines passed through it. The city had a population of 12,000. The walls were in poor condition. The garrison numbered about 50 men, all of the first or second circle. Bandits on the trade routes were a constant problem. 3 caravans had been raided in the past 2 months. The merchants' losses amounted to approximately 800 gold coins per month. That was a lot, enough for the merchants to start looking for alternative routes. If they found another route, Varath would die as a trading hub. And with it, Dorian's last source of income would die as well. But Dorian saw these figures not as a problem, but as an opportunity. If he could ensure the caravan's safety, he would gain control over the flow of goods. Control over the flow of goods means money. Money means people. People mean power. And one more thing. In the Chronicles, he found a mention that several noble families live in the Eastern lands, with unmarried daughters possessing rare talents. House Calith, the head of the family's daughter, 17 years old. Talent, dragon blood. The ability to enhance the physical body to limits 10 times greater than those of an ordinary human. House Arenthis, the advisor's daughter, 19 years old. A talent. The third eye, the ability to see mana flows and predict an opponent's actions fractions of a second before they occur. 2 potential pacts, 2 new talents. If the multiplier remains the same, this means Dragon's Blood at the 12th circle level and a gift of Foresight at a level unmatched by any mage in Ashenmoor. Dorian closed the chronicle. His hands weren't shaking, but his heart was beating faster than usual. The system responded matter-of-factly. The number of simultaneous pacts is unlimited. Each new pact activates a separate channel. The bearer's empty channels can accommodate an unlimited number of talents. The multiplier depends on the depth of the bond and can increase. 2 days before his departure, an event occurred that Dorian hadn't planned for. Renval invited him to a sparring match. The invitation was public. The training hall. 12 courtiers, several guard officers. Renval wanted to demonstrate the gulf between them. One last humiliation before his younger brother would vanish into the eastern wilderness. Dorian accepted the invitation. Lyriel found out about it and came to see him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were tense. She said it was a trap and that Renval wanted to break something in him before he left, so that he'd arrive in Varath crippled and unable to even run a trading post. Dorian nodded. He said he knew. She asked why he had agreed then. Dorian replied that he needed to understand his limits, and that there was no better way than a fight with a 7th circle mage. His resonance with Lyriel increased by 2 points, 13 out of 50. The system explained that taking risks together with an ally accelerates the accumulation. The training hall. A stone floor. A high ceiling with ventilation grills. Spectators stood behind a barrier along the walls. Renval was already in the center, unarmed. He didn't need a weapon. His magic was fire-based. Seventh circle. The temperature of his flames could melt iron. Dorian stepped onto the platform. He was wearing ordinary training. He looked exactly the same as always. Thin, short, with slumped shoulders. Renval looked at him and shook his head. He'd said it wouldn't take long. One of the guard officers gave the signal to begin. Renval didn't wait. He thrust his right arm forward, and a stream of fire burst from his palm. Not at full power, maybe a third, enough to knock anyone without magical protection off their feet. Dorian didn't budge. He raised his left hand. A wall of ice rose before him in a split second. The 2 days leading up to his departure passed in a strange silence. No one came to Dorian with questions. Not Renval, not the Chancellor, not his father. The silence spoke louder than any interrogation. It meant they were discussing him behind closed doors. Dorian used those 2 days to the fullest. He asked Lyriel to conduct a joint training session. Not to teach him anything new, his control over ice already surpassed hers. But the system awarded resonance points for working together. Over 2 days of intensive training with Lyriel, he earned 9 points. His current resonance was 22 out of 50. They trained in the basement of the West Wing, a place no one used. Damp walls, a low ceiling, perfect for keeping them out of sight. Lyriel showed him the forms of the ice techniques she'd been taught since childhood. Dorian repeated them on the first try. Every single one, without a single mistake. Lyriel watched him and shook her head. She said that in 14 years of training, she hadn't achieved what he was doing in seconds. Dorian replied that it wasn't his doing, that the system multiplies, not creates. Without her talent as the foundation, he would have nothing. Lyriel was silent for a moment. Then she said that this was the first time anyone had called her talent valuable rather than merely useful. The resonance increased by 3 points. 25 out of 50. Half. The morning of their departure, the courtyard was half empty. None of his older brothers had come out to see him off. Dorian's mother had died in childbirth. He had no close realities at court besides Lyriel. The caravan consisted of 4 wagons, 20 soldiers, 10 servants. Lyriel with 2 personal maids. Dorian rode on horseback. Chancellor Harwin stood on the balcony and watched as the caravan left the palace gates. Renval stood beside him. Renval said he wanted to know where the Fourth's magic came from. Harwin replied that he was working on it. Renval said the Chancellor had 1 month. If there was no answer in a month, he would send his men to Verath personally. Harwin nodded. He had already sent 2 agents with the caravan. They looked like ordinary servants. One of them could read mana flows from a distance. The other was a trained Fourth Circle assassin, just in case Dorian turned out to be more than just an anomaly, but a real threat. The journey to Verath took 7 days. The road wound through wooded foothills and rocky plains. On the second day of the journey, the caravan stopped for the night near an abandoned roadside fortress. Dorian was standing by the campfire when one of the soldiers approached and reported that he had seen tracks in the forest. Many tracks. At least 20 people. Fresh. Dorian showed no sign of concern. He asked which direction the tracks were heading. The soldier said the tracks ran parallel to the road, as if someone had been moving alongside the caravan but had not ventured into the open. Bandits. The very same ones who robbed caravans on the eastern route. 20 men against 20 soldiers of the Second Circle. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an even fight, but the bandits on the eastern route were no ordinary robbers. From the reports Dorian had read in the library, It appeared they were led by a former officer named Garen, a deserter from a border fortress in the Fourth Circle. And he had not 20, but closer to 40 fighters. 20 sets of tracks meant that the second group had already approached from the other side. Dorian gave the order. The soldiers exchanged glances. None of them were used to taking orders from the prince without magic, but the order was specific and reasonable. Form a circle with the wagons. Gather the horses in the center. Extinguish the fires. 4 lookouts along the perimeter. The rest would take turns sleeping. The senior soldier, a sergeant named Brogan, looked at Dorian. He had served for 20 years. He had seen plenty of young nobles who tried to play at being commanders. Most of them were useless. But the order was sound, tactically sound. Brogan carried it out without question. The night passed quietly. The bandits did not attack. They were waiting for open terrain where the caravan couldn't use cover. Dorian knew this. He had studied the route map and knew that after 2 days' travel, the road led out onto a rocky plain without a single tree for 5 kilometers. The perfect spot for an ambush. He told Lyriel about the plan. Lyriel listened. Then she asked how many of the bandits he could stop on his own. Dorian replied that if there were no more than 40 of them and none were above the Fourth Circle, he could stop them all. Lyriel looked at him intently. She said she wanted to see it with her own eyes. Resonance +2, 27 out of 50. On the 4th day of their journey, the caravan emerged onto the plain. The sun was high in the sky. There was no wind. Visibility was perfect. After 20 minutes of traveling across the open space, Dorian heard a whistle. Armed men ran out from behind rock outcroppings on both sides. He counted 38 of them. All were clad in leather with swords and axes. 5 carried short bows. Garen walked in the center of the group, tall, broad-shouldered, a scar running from his temple to his chin. He was the only one who wasn't running. He was walking, calmly, confidently, like a man who had done this dozens of times. Garen raised his hand, and his men stopped halfway. He shouted to the caravan drivers that they could leave alive if they abandoned their wagons. A common offer, standard. He knew that a convoy of 20 Second Circle soldiers was no match for his detachment. Dorian leaped down from his horse. He walked past his soldiers and stepped forward. Brogan flinched, about to stop him, but Dorian shook his head. Garen looked at the young man who had come out to meet him. Thin, short, unarmed, unarmored. Garen smirked. He asked if the pup had mistaken the door for something else. Dorian didn't answer the question. He took a step forward and struck the ground with his right palm. The ground cracked. Not literally, but a wave of cold surged from the point of impact across the rocky plain at the speed of a running man. The grass was covered in frost. The stones glistened with ice. The air temperature within a 30-meter radius dropped 20 degrees in 2 seconds. The bandits on the front flank felt it first. Their breath turned to steam. Their fingers on the sword hilts turned white from the cold. One of the archers tried to pull back the bowstring. His fingers wouldn't obey him. Dorian straightened up and looked at Garen. Garen's smile faded. He was a warrior of the Fourth Circle. He could sense the flow of mana. And what he was sensing now was impossible. The boy standing before him radiated a power that surpassed anything Garen had encountered in the last 10 years. It was the level of a mage he'd only heard about from the commanders of the border fortress. Dorian raised his right hand. Ice began to form in the air. Not just one needle, dozens. They swirled around his hand like a swarm of glass dragonflies, each one as long as a palm. Each one razor sharp. Dorian wasn't making a threat. He simply stood there. The needles spun. The air hummed with cold. Garen took a step back, then another. Then he turned to his men and barked a brief command. The bandits began to retreat, quickly, silently. Some ran. Garen was the last to leave. He turned around once. He looked at Dorian, and in his eyes was not fear, it was respect, mixed with caution. He knew when to retreat. That was precisely why he had lived so long. When the bandits disappeared behind the stone ledges, Dorian lowered his hand. The needles crumbled into icy dust. He turned toward the caravan. 20 soldiers were staring at him. Brogan stood with his mouth agape. He'd seen mages before. He'd served under a fifth circle mage. But what this boy had done was different. The scale, the speed, the control. This wasn't the level of a novice mage. It was the level of a veteran who'd been honing his craft for decades. Brogan looked at Dorian with new eyes. He saluted, briefly, in military fashion, without words. Dorian nodded and mounted his horse again. The caravan moved on. Lyriel was riding in the wagon. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see everything. The system reported. Resonance with Lyriel had increased by 5 points, 32 out of 50. On the 6th day of the journey, another incident occurred. One of the caravan's servants tried to search Dorian's personal belongings during the night. Dorian wasn't asleep. He lay with his eyes closed, but could sense the movement of air through his ice sensor. He had learned this yesterday. Any creature with a body temperature higher than the ambient temperature created a heat signature that Dorian could track from a distance of up to 10 meters. The servant crept up to the bag. His hands moved with professional stealth, but his body was warm. Dorian let him open the bag. Then he said quietly that if the man wanted to live, he'd better freeze. The servant froze. Dorian sat up. He looked at the man's face. Young, around 25, plain-looking, the kind of face you wouldn't remember in a crowd. Dorian asked who had sent him, the Chancellor or Renvol. The servant was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said, the Chancellor. Dorian asked what exactly he was supposed to find out. The servant replied that it was the nature of the prince's magic and whether there was an artifact. Dorian nodded. He said he would pass a message to the Chancellor through this servant. The message was simple. Dorian devoted his first 10 days in Varath to 3 things: exploring the city, consolidating his position, and gathering intelligence. 3 key moments during those 10 days determined everything that followed. The first moment. On the second day, Dorian walked the entire length of Varath, from the northern gate to the southern market, from the blacksmith's quarter to the fisherman's pier on the Vel River. He spoke with merchants, artisans, and fishermen, with the owner of the only tavern. He didn't introduce himself as a prince. He was simply the new administrator, thin, young, and unescorted. People spoke to him easily because they saw no threat in him. He learned that Magor took a cut from every caravan that passed through the city gates. Officially, it was called a transit toll. Unofficially, it was money that went directly to the commandant and his inner circle. He learned that 3 months ago, 2 merchants who had refused to pay had disappeared from the city. Their bodies were never found. He learned that Garen and his gang weren't just robbing caravans. They were robbing the specific caravans that Magor pointed out. In exchange for information on routes and cargo, the bandit paid the commandant a fixed cut. The corruption wasn't just deep-rooted, it was a system that had been operating for years. Second scene. On the 5th day, Dorian invited Lyriel on a walk through the city. On the surface, it looked like the new governor was showing his wife his domain. In reality, Dorian was using their time together to build resonance. They walked through the blacksmith's quarter. Lyriel stopped at an old armorer's workshop. She looked at the blades hanging on the wall. Then she said that at House Sarath, blacksmiths use ice hardening to create the finest blades. The temperature shock makes the steel harder. If Dorian can control the temperature down to the degree, then he can forge blades better than any blacksmith on the continent. Dorian looked at her. She wasn't just watching, she was thinking. She was looking for ways to turn his power into a practical advantage. The resonance increased by 3 points, 35 out of 50. He walked into the workshop. An old armorer named Fenwick looked at him without much interest. Dorian asked to see a blank. Fenwick tossed him a strip of steel. Dorian took it in his hands and sent a wave of cold through it. Controlled, precise, minus 40 degrees for 3 seconds. Then he let go. The steel rang out as he placed it on the anvil. The sound was different. Cleaner. Better. Fenwick took the strip and bent it. It wouldn't bend. He pressed harder. It wouldn't yield. He looked at Dorian, then at the strip, then back at Dorian. In 30 years of work, he'd never seen tempering of this quality. He asked how much the prince's services cost. Dorian replied that they were free in exchange for information. Third cut. On the 8th day, Dorian received from Fenwick the names of 3 merchants who were willing to work directly with the new administrator, bypassing Magor. They were wealthy enough to wield influence and resentful enough of the commandant to take the risk. Dorian met with them at a tavern. He offered them a simple deal. He would personally ensure the safety of their caravans. In exchange, they would pay their toll not to the commandant, but to the governor's treasury. The merchants exchanged glances. The eldest among them, named Verdun, asked how exactly one man intended to secure a trade route 100 kilometers long. Dorian placed his palm on the table. The wood beneath his fingers was covered in frost. The mug of beer standing nearby froze solid in 2 seconds. The foam turned into an icy crust. Verdun looked at the mug. He looked at Dorian. And for the first time during the conversation, his expression changed. Skepticism gave way to calculation. He said he needed to think it over. 2 days later, all 3 agreed. The result of 10 days. Dorian had 3 merchants ready to pay into his treasury, an information network of artisans and fishermen, and the realization that Magor was not just a corrupt commander, but a link in a chain stretching all the way back to the capital. Someone at court was receiving a cut from the robberies on the Eastern Highway. Someone had an interest in keeping Varath weak and dependent. Meanwhile, Lyriel was handling her part of the operation. She organized the city's financial records, the real ones, not the one Magor had been keeping. She discovered that of the 120 gold pieces in the monthly budget, only 40 reached the garrison. The remaining 80 were disappearing. Lyriel's resonance had risen to 38 out of 50. The system reported that upon reaching 40 points, an intermediate body enhancement. Dorian had no intention of waiting. On the 11th day, he sent Brogan with 10 soldiers to patrol the trade route. Over the past few days, Brogan had become his right-hand man. The old sergeant didn't ask questions about the nature of Dorian's magic. He saw strength, he saw intelligence. He saw that this man's orders made sense. For Brogan, that was enough. The patrol ran into Garen's scouts on the 2nd day. 4 bandits. Brogan and his men took 3 of them alive. The 4th got away. That was part of the plan. Dorian wanted Garen to find out. Interrogating the 3 prisoners yielded valuable information. Garen's main base was located in an abandoned stone quarry 20 kilometers northeast of Varath. The gang's strength? 44 men. 6 of them were from the 3rd circle. Garen was from the 4th. Their weaponry was average. They had a 2-month supply of food. Dorian studied this data. 44 fighters against his 20 2nd circle soldiers and his own 6th circle unit. In a direct confrontation, he could wipe out the gang single-handedly, but that would create several problems. First, too blatant a display of force would draw the capital's attention before he was ready. Second, dead bandits are dead bandits. Living bandits are potential soldiers. Dorian didn't want to wipe out the gang. He wanted to absorb it. He devised a plan, and for that plan, he needed Garen alive. On the 12th day, Dorian left the city alone, without soldiers, without Lyriel. He headed north, on foot. His icy perception had expanded to 20 meters over the past few days. He could sense every living creature within that radius. After 4 hours of walking, he found himself half a kilometer from a stone quarry. He chose a vantage point on high ground and sat down. Then he raised his hand. The air temperature around him began to drop, slowly. Not abruptly, as in battle, but gradually. A wave of cold spread out from him in concentric circles. 10 minutes later, the temperature within a radius of 100 meters had dropped by 15 degrees. 20 minutes later, Garen's sentries began to shiver. 30 minutes later, Garen himself emerged from the quarry. He stood at the edge of the quarry and looked up at the hill. He couldn't see Dorian, but he sensed the source of the cold. His scar, running from his temple to his chin, had turned white from the frost. Dorian stood up. He walked down from the hill into the open space. Garen saw him. It was that same boy from the road. Garen didn't take a single step. He stood there and waited. Dorian approached to within 30 meters and stopped. He said he had a proposal. Garen listened. Dorian spoke briefly. Commandant Mygor was betraying both him and the bandits. He's taking money from both sides. He's leaking information about the caravans, but he's also leaking information about the gang to agents in the capital. In 6 months, a year at most, the capital will send a punitive expedition. Garen and his men will be wiped out. Not because they're a threat to the kingdom, but because someone at court will decide that this scheme is no longer profitable enough. Garen remained. His face was stony. Dorian continued. He offered an alternative. Garen and his men would join the Varath garrison as a mercenary militia. They would receive a salary, food, and protection from the capital. In exchange, they would answer to Dorian and guard the trade route instead of plundering it. Garen asked why he should trust a boy who, just a week ago, had frightened him with a swarm of ice needles. Dorian replied that that was precisely why, because he could offer the strength to protect them all, and because the alternative was death, not at his hand, but at the hands of a punitive squad that would arrive in half a year. Garen thought for a long time. His men began to emerge from the quarry. They stood behind their commander. Over 40 men, armed, on guard. Garen looked at them, then back at Dorian. He said there was one condition. If Dorian could defeat him in a one-on-one duel, he and his men would submit. If not, they would leave. Dorian agreed. Garen attacked first. He was a fourth circle mage. His magic was earth-based. He could harden the ground beneath his feet to the consistency of stone and use it as projectiles. The first strike was a stone fist the size of a head, driven from the ground and aimed at Dorian's chest. Dorian didn't dodge. He held out his palm. An ice shield the size of a door formed in half a second. The stone fist struck the ice and shattered into fragments. The shield didn't even crack. Garen fired a series of 5 stone projectiles. 3 hit the shield. Dorian deflected 2 with a blast of icy wind. Garen sank into the ground. Literally. His legs sank knee-deep into the soil, and he lunged forward, gliding across the ground as if on water. His right fist was covered in a stone crust. The blow was aimed at Dorian's head. Dorian took a step back and caught Garen's fist with an icy gauntlet that had formed around his palm a split second before contact. The stone crust from the cold. Garen felt the cold seeping through his armor. He felt his muscles begin to slow down. He felt the blood in his arm thicken. He tried to pull his hand away. Dorian wouldn't let go. Ice spread up Garen's arm from his fist to his elbow. A thin layer, not dangerous, but paralyzing. Dorian said that he could freeze him up to his shoulder, then to his chest. Then his heart would stop. Or Garen could accept the terms. Garen tried to use his other hand. The ground beneath Dorian's feet exploded into shards of stone. 3 of them struck Dorian in the legs. He didn't waver. His body was covered by a thin layer of icy armor that formed automatically when threatened. It was a skill he'd discovered 2 days earlier and hadn't shown to anyone yet. Dorian increased the pressure. The ice reached Garen's elbow. The thug's fingers turned blue. The body's fortification had begun that night. Dorian was lying on the bed in the administrative residence when he felt warmth spreading through his muscles. Not heat, not pain. A deep, steady warmth that penetrated his bones and tendons. The system reported that intermediate strengthening had been activated. His physical parameters would be brought into alignment with the fourth circle. The process would take 6 hours. Maximum magic capacity upon completion, the 7th circle. Dorian closed his UN. When he woke up in the morning, his body felt different. Not bigger, not bulkier, but denser. Every movement was more precise, every breath deeper. He clenched his fist and felt a strength he hadn't had yesterday. Not magical, physical. His muscles had become firmer. His reflexes were faster. The 7th circle, the same level as Renval's. But Renval had achieved this through 10 years of grueling training and 3 mentors. Dorian had gained the physical prowess of the 4th circle in a single night, and the magic of the 7th circle through a pact with an ally. He stood by the window, looking out at Varath, a dirty little town on the edge of the kingdom, his prison, his launching pad. Lyriel entered the room. She paused. She looked at Dorian and tilted her head. She said he looked different. Dorian turned. She was right. He stood straighter. His shoulders were broader. Just a little, but enough for someone who spent every day with him to notice the difference. He said that the system had strengthened his body overnight, that his ceiling had risen to the 7th circle. Lyriel nodded. Then she said that if he was going to deal with Magor, she needed to know the plan. Because Mygor controlled the garrison, and if the garrison sided with him, Dorian's 20 soldiers and 44 former bandits would find themselves under siege inside the city. Dorian sat down at the table. He spread out a map of Varath and began to explain. The plan wasn't a military one, it was a financial one. Dorian wasn't going to storm the barracks. He was going to bring down the monetary system that kept Mygor in place. Step 1. Reroute the flow of caravans. The 3 merchants with whom he'd struck a deal accounted for roughly 40% of the flow of goods through Varath. The remaining 60% was controlled by merchants who paid Mygor. If Dorian offered these merchants better terms and real protection, they would switch to his side. Without the flow of goods, Mygor would have no money to bribe the garrison. Step 2. Garen and his men would take up positions along the trade route. They will guard the caravans. Mygor's garrison will no longer be the only armed force in the region. Step 3. The Chancellor's agent. Dorian knew that this man was still gathering information. Instead of neutralizing him, Dorian intended to use him. Through the agent, he would send accurate data on Mygor's corruption to the capital, but not in his own name. The data would appear to be an independent report. Chancellor Harwin would receive proof that his man in Varath was stealing from the crown. Harwin might not like Dorian, but Harwin loves money. And the money Mygor had been stealing was bypassing the Chancellor. Lyriel listened. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said the plan was good. But there was one element Dorian hadn't taken into account. Mygor wouldn't just sit and wait to be financially strangled. He'll strike, and he'll strike first. Because people backed into a corner always act sooner than expected. Dorian looked at her. She was right. He hadn't accounted for his reaction speed. The resonance increased by 2 points, 44 out of 50. The system reported that the resonance multiplier had been increased. Proximity to the threshold accelerates the accumulation. Dorian took action that very day. He sent Brogan to the 5 merchants who had not yet joined. The offer was simple: caravan security, ice hardening for their goods from the blacksmith's quarter at cost, and no extortion from the commandant. Of the 5, 3 agreed on the first day. The 4th asked for time to consider. The 5th refused. He was Magor's son-in-law. That was to be expected. At the same time, Garin led 20 men out onto the highway. They split into 4 groups of 5 and took up positions along key sections of the road. The bandits who, just a week ago, had been robbing caravans were now guarding them. The first caravan passed under their protection the next morning. 16 wagons carrying copper and cloth. The caravan leader, named Farron, was skeptical. He had been leading caravans along this route for 20 years. He had seen how 4 soldiers from the commandant's office would pretend to patrol the road and then disappear half an hour before an attack. He didn't believe anything would change. When his caravan reached Verath without a single incident, Farron jumped down from his wagon and stood in the middle of the market square. He looked at his wagons, all 16 of them, intact, fully loaded. For the first time in 11 months. He asked Brogan whom to thank. Brogan pointed to Dorian, who was standing by the gate. Farron looked at the gaunt young man with white traces of frost on the sleeves of his jacket. He didn't say thank you. He said that if this continued, he was willing to pay double the toll. Magor learned what was happening by the end of the 3rd day. His son-in-law came and told him that the merchants were leaving, that armed men loyal to the prince had appeared on the road, that the caravans were passing by the garrison posts without paying the toll. Magor sat in his study. He listened. His expression did not change, but his hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that the wood creaked. 12 years. For 12 years he had been building this system. He had turned Verath into his personal feeding trough. He had fed the bandits so they would feed him. He had fed his patron in the capital so that he would turn a blind eye. Everything had run like clockwork. And now, some kid without a shred of magic. He stumbled over his words. Without a shred of magic. His informant at the garrison had told him about the wall of ice on the road, about the swarm of ice needles, about how Garin had accepted defeat after a one-on-one duel. The king's 4th son, who 3 months ago couldn't even light a candle, was now displaying magic no less than 6th circle level. Magor didn't understand how this was possible, but he knew he had no time to ponder it. He sent a messenger to the capital, an urgent letter. Not to the chancellor, to his true patron, the man behind the entire scheme, the 3rd prince of Ashenmoor. Renval wasn't the only brother to be wary of. The 3rd prince, Kale Vel, 5th circle. Less conspicuous than Renval, less powerful, but far more cunning. Kale ran a network of trade operations throughout the eastern region. Officially, he was the administrator of the crown's eastern revenues. Unofficially, he was the one who skimmed off 1/3 of those revenues through a scheme involving bandits and corrupt commanders. Verath was just one of 7 cities in his network. Dorian didn't know about Kale, yet, but he knew that someone was pulling the strings behind Magor, and through the Chancellor's agent, he was going to find out who it was. On the 5th day of the plan's execution, Dorian met with the agent. The meeting took place in the back room of a tavern. The agent thought he'd been summoned for questioning. He was bracing for the worst. Dorian offered him a seat and a drink. The agent sat down. His hands rested on the table. His fingers were tense, ready to reach for a knife. Dorian said he knew who he was. He knew who had sent him, and he had no grievances against him. Chancellor Harwin had acted in the interests of the crown. Spying on the 4th prince had been his duty, but Dorian had information that would interest the Chancellor far more than the nature of ice magic. The agent listened. Dorian described Magor's scheme. No names, no details that would point to the source, just numbers. How much gold bypasses the treasury, how much ends up in pockets, how much the crown loses each year. The agent raised an eyebrow. The figures were convincing. 8,000 gold pieces a year. That was enough to catch Chancellor Harwin's attention. Dorian said he would send a full report in a week through the agent with evidence. He asked for only one thing, that the Chancellor take no action until Dorian gave the signal. The agent asked why he should trust the prince. Dorian replied that the agent had no choice, because if the Chancellor found out that his agent had spent 2 weeks in Varath and failed to uncover a scheme to embezzle 8,000 gold pieces a year, the Chancellor would conclude that the agent is either incompetent or bribed, and both outcomes end the same way. The agent was silent for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. He said he would pass on the message. On the 6th day, Magor struck. Not as Dorian had expected. Not with military force. Not with an attack. He struck through others. The 4th merchant, who had asked for time to think it over, was found dead in his home. A stab in the back. The merchant's wife said she'd seen 2 men in dark cloaks. The city froze. The merchants who'd sided with Dorian began to get nervous. One of them, Verdun, came to see Dorian that evening. His face was ashen. He said that if the prince couldn't protect their lives, then all the deals were worthless. Dorian looked at Verdun. He didn't try to reassure him. He didn't make any promises. He said that in 3 days, Commander Magor would no longer be a problem, and that if Verdun wanted to see exactly how, he need only wait. Verdun left unconvinced, but he didn't back out of the deal, because the alternative was to return to Magor's protection, and a man who kills merchants for disobedience would kill him sooner or later, too. Dorian returned to the residence. Lyriel was waiting for him. She said that the merchant's murder changed the situation, that now they needed to act sooner than planned. Dorian nodded. He said he was scrapping the financial plan. It was too slow. Now they would take direct action. Lyriel asked what exactly he was going to do. Dorian replied with a single sentence. He said that in the morning he would go to Magor in person and take the city from him. His resonance with Lyriel reached 46 out of 50 points. It was a gloomy morning. Gray skies, light rain. Dorian left the residence and headed for the garrison barracks. With him were Brogan and 4 soldiers. Outside the city walls, Garen had stationed 20 men at all the approaches. Not for an attack, for a blockade. No one could leave Varath without Dorian's knowledge. He entered the barracks. 50 garrison soldiers were watching him. Half of them knew who he was. The other half were seeing him for the first time. Magor stood at a table in the command room. Behind him were 2 of his closest associates. Both were members of the 3rd Circle. Magor looked at Dorian. He asked what brought the administrator to visit. Dorian didn't waste any time. He said that, effective immediately, the garrison of Varath would come under his direct command. By virtue of his authority as administrator of the Eastern Trade Corridor, granted to him by royal decree, he stated that Commandant Magor was being relieved of his duties, pending an investigation into the embezzlement of public funds. Magor smirked. He said the boy had lost his mind. That his authority did not extend to the garrison, that only the capital could replace the commandant. Dorian pulled a scroll from his belt. It was the original royal decree appointing him. It contained a line that Dorian found on his 4th reading. The governor has the right to temporarily suspend any official within his jurisdiction in the event of reasonable suspicion of harm to the interests of the crown. The line was written in small print. It was inserted between paragraphs. Perhaps the chancellor had included it as a standard clause without thinking that anyone would ever make use of it. Magor read the line. His expression changed. He looked at his men. 2 3rd Circle mages stood on either side of him. Their hands reached for their weapons. Dorian took a step forward. The temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. Magor's breath turned to steam. The raindrops on the windows turned into icicles. Dorian said he didn't want bloodshed, but if anyone in that room drew a weapon, he'd be done with it in 4 seconds. The two third circle mages exchanged glances. They sensed the power emanating from this scrawny boy. The sixth circle, no, the seventh. It was more than all of them combined were capable of. One of them slowly withdrew his hand from his sword. The second followed suit 3 seconds later. Magor stood alone. His network was crumbling. His men were retreating. 2 teens of control were coming to an end in a damp barracks under a light rain. He looked into Dorian's eyes and saw absolute certainty there. Magor's messenger reached the capital in 5 days. The letter reached the third prince, Kale Vel, that same evening. Kale read it twice, the first time quickly, the second time slowly. Then he burned the paper in the fireplace and sat by the window of his study in the palace's east wing. He looked out at the city at night and thought. The fourth brother, political trash, empty channels, zero magic. Now that Zero was wielding sixth circle ice magic and seizing the city that had brought Kale 3,000 gold pieces a year. Kale was nothing like Renval. Renval was a sword, straight, heavy, predictable. Kale was poison, quiet, slow, imperceptible until the victim began coughing up blood. The fifth circle of power, the magic of illusions, the ability to create images indistinguishable from reality. But his main weapon wasn't magic. His main weapon was a network. 7 cities along the eastern route. 7 commanders who paid him a cut. 4 gangs that operated under his command. 12 merchants who laundered money through legitimate transactions. Total annual income, about 20,000 gold pieces. The official treasury of the Eastern Territories brought the crown 30,000. Kale took nearly as much for himself, unofficially. The loss of Varath was not merely the loss of 3,000 gold pieces. It was a crack in the system. If Dorian started digging deeper, he would get to the other 6 cities. Kale could not allow that to happen. But he could not act openly either. Sending soldiers against the fourth prince would mean drawing his father's attention, and King Ashenmore, for all his coldness toward his youngest son, would not tolerate fratricide. Kale decided to take a different approach. He summoned a man named Draven. Draven held no official position at court. He did not wear a uniform. He did not appear at public events. But everyone who had dealt with the dark side of Ashenmore politics knew his name. Problem solver, the sixth circle, shadow magic, the ability to dissolve into any shadow and move between them over a distance of up to 50 meters. Kale gave him a task. Don't kill Dorian. That would draw too much attention. Instead, destroy his infrastructure, his merchants, allies, sources of income. Make sure Dorian was left alone in an empty city without money, without people, without a reason to stay. And then he would return to the capital on his own, broken, useless, just as it was meant to be from the very beginning. Draven nodded and vanished into the shadow of the doorway, literally. Meanwhile, in Varath, Dorian wasted no time. A week had passed since Magor's ouster. The city was changing, not quickly, but noticeably. The first thing the residents noticed were the patrols. Previously, garrison soldiers had appeared on the streets twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, merely as a formality. Now patrols ran around the clock. Brogan's soldiers and Garen's fighters divided up the routes. No conflicts. Brogan was a tough professional. Garen was a pragmatist. They didn't become friends, but they respected their common commander, and that was enough. The second thing the merchants noticed was the tolls. Dorian had lowered the transit toll from 12% to 7%. The difference was significant. During the first week, 4 more caravans than usual passed through Varath. Word of the safe route spread quickly. The third thing Dorian noticed was a letter. It arrived on the 8th day after Ma's ouster Agor. No signature, no seal. The courier delivered it and vanished. Inside was a single line. The head of House Caliph invites the governor of Varath to a hunt at the Caliph estate in 4 days. Dorian read the line. Then he read it again. House Caliph, the family with a daughter of dragon blood. An invitation to a hunt is a traditional form of diplomatic contact between aristocratic houses in the eastern lands. An informal meeting, no protocol, no witnesses. A place where one can discuss what cannot be discussed at court. Dorian showed the letter to Lyriel. She read it and looked up. She said that the House of Caliph doesn't send invitations without a reason. They want something, or they know something, or both. Dorian nodded. He said he would go. Lyriel said she would go with him. Dorian thought for a second. Then he agreed. Their joint appearance at the Caliph estate would send a certain signal. Prince Vel and the heiress of Sarath acting as one. That is power. Before leaving, Dorian placed Varath under the command of Brogan and Garen. He gathered them both and explained their areas of responsibility. Brogan was in charge of the city. Garen was in charge of the road. Decisions would be made jointly. In case of disagreement, they were to wait for his return. If a threat arose that the two of them could not neutralize on their own, they were to close the gates and hold the city until his arrival. Brogan nodded. Garen smirked. He said that in 20 years, no one had ever appointed him to defend a city he'd plundered just a year ago. Dorian replied that the world was full of surprises. The journey to the Caliph estate took 2 days. The estate stood in the foothills on the border between Sarath's territory and the wild lands. Stone walls, towers with narrow windows, stables for 40 horses' shades. And the smell. A smell Dorian detected half a kilometer before the gates. Heat, sulfur, something primal and dangerous. The smell of dragon's blood. The head of the Caliph house greeted them in person. His name was Torvan Caliph. Tall, broad-shouldered, a graying beard. The sixth circle. His magic was fire-based, but not like Renval's. Torvan's fire was dark red, almost burgundy. The flame of dragon's blood that had been passed down in his family from generation to generation. Torvan looked at Dorian, then at Lyriel, then back at Dorian. His gaze lingered a second longer than it should have. He said he was pleased to welcome the prince and his wife, that the hunt would begin tomorrow morning, that there would be dinner tonight. Everything was very formal. Everything was done just right. But Dorian noticed how Torvan cast a quick glance at his servant when he thought the guests weren't looking. The servant nodded and disappeared inside the estate. Something was being prepared. Dinner took place in the estate's great hall. 6 people sat at the table. Torvan, his wife, Dorian, Lyriel, Torvan's eldest son, Brennan, 17 years old, 4th circle, with a haughty gaze and hands that clenched into fists every time Dorian spoke, and Torvan's daughter. Her name was Irith Caliph, 17 years old, short, slender, dark red hair, eyes the color of molten amber. 4th circle, talent, dragon blood. When she entered the hall, Dorian felt a heat, not metaphorical, real. The air temperature around Irith was 3 degrees higher than in the rest of the hall. Her body generated heat constantly, a side effect of dragon blood. The system reacted instantly. Potential ally detected. Talent, dragon's blood, 4th circle, estimated multiplier upon forming a pact. 4. Equivalent after cloning, 16th circle. Warning, the host's physical body cannot withstand a load exceeding the 9th circle. Further reinforcement is required. 16th circle. Dorian kept a straight face. He continued eating, but inside, his thoughts were racing at breakneck speed. Even with the restriction to the ninth circle, this would be monstrous power. Dragon blood enhances the physical body. Speed, endurance, regeneration, and resistance to fire and extreme temperatures. The combination of ice magic and dragon blood would create a type of warrior that had never existed in Ashenmoor. Over dinner, Torvan asked questions. Cautious ones. Probing ones. How things were going in Varath. How the prince was handling the eastern trade route. Had he heard about the problems with bandits? Dorian answered briefly. Things were going well. The trade route was under control. Bandits were no longer a problem. Torvan raised an eyebrow at that last answer. He said that Garen and his men had been plaguing the eastern caravans for many years. 4 attempts to clear them out had failed. The last one was led by the commandant of Valhorn Fortress himself, with a detachment of 30 soldiers from the Third Circle. They returned with casualties and no results. Dorian replied that he'd be happy to share the details during tomorrow's hunt. Torvan nodded, but his eyes suggested that he already knew most of the answers. Rumors spread quickly along the eastern road. After dinner, Dorian stepped out onto the balcony. The air in the foothills was crisp and cold. A minute later, Irith joined him. She stopped 3 steps away. Close for a stranger. Far enough for a conversation. She said she'd heard that Prince Vel possessed ice magic. Dorian confirmed it. Irith said that was interesting, because 3 months ago, the entire court knew that the 4th prince wasn't even capable of lighting a candle. Dorian replied that people change. Irith smirked. She said that people don't change that quickly, not without a reason. She said that her father hadn't invited him for the sake of hunting. He'd invited him because the House of Calith was in trouble. The 3rd prince, Kale, was their trade. Taxes are rising every quarter. 2 of Calith's mines were confiscated a year ago under the pretext of debts owed to the crown. The house is losing money and influence. In 2 years, they'll become vassals of Kale rather than an independent house. Dorian listened. Irith spoke plainly. No diplomatic circumlocutions, no hints. She said that her father was looking for an ally strong enough to stand up to Kale, and that the appearance of the 4th prince, with his mysterious magic and ability to command bandits, was a ray of hope for Torvan. Dorian asked what exactly House Calith wanted. Irith said that, specifically, they wanted protection, both military and political, and in exchange, they were ready to discuss an alliance. The hunt began at dawn. Torvan led a party of 12, Torvan himself, his son Brennan, 6 huntsmen, Dorian, Lyriel, and Irith. The target of the hunt was no ordinary game. In the foothills north of the Calith estate lived a mountain shellhorn, a maximum beast weighing 900 pounds. A shell of bony plates on its back and sides, horns 1.5 meters long. A 5th circle creature according to standard classification. Shellhorns were territorial. They did not attack first, but if anyone entered their zone, they would attack without warning and would not stop until the intruder was dead or had left their territory. Torvan explained the hunting plan during a rest stop. The hunters would form a semicircle and drive the beast toward the gorge. Brennan and Torvan would attack from the flanks. The rest were to stay out of the way. Dorian nodded. He noticed that Torvan hadn't included him in the attack plan. It was intentional. Torvan wanted to see what Dorian would do on his own, without instructions, without a specific role. A test. An hour later, the hunters discovered tracks. A shellhorn had passed through here recently, deep indentations in the rocky soil, gouges from its horns on the tree trunks, and the scent of musk and dust. The hunters took up their positions. The half-circle began to close in. 20 minutes later, a low roar rang out from behind a rocky outcrop. The ground vibrated. Shellhorn sensed the beaters and flew into a rage. The beast burst out from behind the rock at full speed. 900 pounds of bony armor and muscle hurtled down the slope like a siege ram. Brennan leaped out to meet it. His hands flared with dark red fire, dragon fire. He unleashed a stream of fire straight into the beast's muzzle. Shellhorn didn't even slow down. Its bony armor deflected the flames like a shield. Brennan managed to jump aside just in time. Shellhorn's horn passed 10 centimeters from his ribs. Torvan attacked from the flank. His flame was more powerful. The sixth circle. A fiercely whip coiled around the beast's hind leg. The Shellhorn stumbled. It collapsed to one knee. It roared, and it lunged forward with such force that the fiery whip snapped. Torvan was sent flying backward. His feet carved 2 furrows in the ground before he came to a stop. The beast spun around and charged straight at Torvan. 900 pounds in a head-on attack. Torvan raised both hands. A wall of fire rose before him. Shellhorn passed through the wall without slowing down. His armor smoked but did not melt. 3 seconds remained until impact. Dorian stepped forward. He placed his right palm on the ground. Ice fanned out across the surface. Not a wall, not a barrier, an icy crust that instantly covered the rocks beneath Shellhorn's feet. The beast lost its footing. Its massive legs splayed apart. 900 pounds crashed to one side. Inertia dragged him another 4 meters across the icy crust. He came to a stop 2 steps away from Torvan. Before the beast could get back up, Dorian was already beside him. Ice was forming around the Shellhorn's front legs. Thick, icy shackles pinned it to the ground. The beast thrashed. It struggled. It roared. But the ice held. Dorian looked at Torvan. He asked how the head of the house wished to finish the hunt. Torvan stood and looked at the fourth prince, who had just stopped a 5th circle beast with a single wave of his hand. Without a weapon. Without training. 4 seconds passed between the beast's first touch of the ground and its complete immobilization of the beast. 4 seconds had passed. Torvan was a warrior. He understood what he was seeing. He saw power of at least the 7th circle, the reaction speed of a trained veteran, and the control that usually comes after 20 years of practice. And standing before him was a boy who wasn't even 20. Torvan approached the fallen beast and finished it off with a strike from his fiery spear to its unguarded throat. Then he turned to Dorian and nodded. A brief, solemn nod, the nod of a warrior acknowledging an equal. Brennan stood to the side. His face was red, not from the fire, from shame. He had attacked first and failed, and the outcast 4th prince had ended the hunt with a single touch. Irith looked at Dorian. Her amber eyes burned with an interest she no longer tried to hide. Lyriel stood beside the huntsman. Her face was calm, but her hands were clenched into fists inside her gloves. She saw how Irith was looking at Dorian, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not jealousy, anxiety. If Dorian were to form a second pact through marriage with Irith, it would change everything. Not just his power, their relationship. The conversation with Torvan took place that same evening, without Brennan, without Torvan's wife. Just Torvan, Dorian, Lyriel, and Irith. The 4 of them sat at a table in the estate's hunting room. The walls were hung with trophies, a Shellhorn's head, a mountain wolf's pelt, the fangs of something very large and very dead. Torvan spoke first. He outlined the situation at House Calith. 2 confiscated mines, rising taxes, threats from the Kale people, trade blockades, debts that are being artificially created. In 2 years, the House of Calith has lost 40% of its income. If the trend continues, in a year's time, it won't even be able to afford the estate's security. Dorian listened. When Torvan finished, Dorian asked one question. He asked why Torvan hadn't appealed to the king. Torvan smiled bitterly. He replied that he had, twice. The first time, he was told his complaint was under review. The second time, he was told there was insufficient evidence. Chancellor Harwin personally signed the rejection. Dorian nodded. Chancellor Harwin did not work directly for Kale, but Harwin worked for whoever paid more, and Kale paid enough for the Chancellor to turn a blind eye. Dorian proposed terms. The House of Calith would receive military protection from Varath. Dorian would personally guarantee the safety of Calith's trade routes. The confiscated mines would be returned through official channels. Dorian would find a way. In exchange, the House of Calith would recognize Dorian Vel as their suzerain and form an alliance sealed by marriage. Torvan looked at Irith. Irith looked at Dorian. She said she had a condition. If this marriage took place, she wanted to retain the right to command the Calith estate's guard. She would not be merely a wife at court. She would be a warrior. Dorian replied that he did not need a wife at court. He needed an ally on the battlefield. Irith bowed her head. The heat around her intensified. But an expression appeared on her face that Dorian had never seen before. Not interest. Respect. Torvan held out his hand. Dorian shook it. The ceremony was set for 5 days later. There was no Hall of Roots at the Calith estate. There was no ancient stone. But Dorian already knew the stone wasn't necessary. The system had reported that the pact would be activated through a blood ritual on any surface connected to the ancestral land. The stone floor of the Calith estate, which had stood on that land for 400 years, was perfect. Draven's attack came on the return journey to Varath. A party of 6 was traveling along a forest road. Dorian, Lyriel, Irith, 2 Calith rangers whom Torvan had sent as temporary guards, and the wagon driver. It was night, the second day of the journey. They were half a day's journey from Varath. Dorian sensed the forest through his icy perception. The radius had expanded to 30 meters after his body had been strengthened. Every living creature with a temperature higher than the ambient environment created a thermal signature. Birds, small animals, insects, everything was in its place. And then he noticed an anomaly. A cold spot, the size of a person, but without any heat. As if a piece of space had simply vanished from the thermal spectrum. The spot was moving, fast, parallel to the road, in the shadows of the trees. Dorian didn't turn his head. He didn't change his pace. He touched Lyriel's hand and squeezed her fingers twice. The signal they'd practiced back in Varath. Danger. Do not react. Lyriel froze for a second. Then she continued walking as if nothing had happened. Dorian mentally addressed the system. A cold spot. No heat signature. What is it? The system replied. Shadow magic. A practitioner of this type of magic absorbs their own heat signature, blending into the surrounding shadows. To detect it through icy perception, one must look not for heat, but for its absence. One shadow magic user detected. Distance, 22 meters. Direction, left flank. Circle rating, 6th. 6th circle. The same level as his ice magic before amplification. But Dorian was no longer at the 6th circle. He was at the 8th, with the physical strength of the 9th. Dorian kept walking. He thought. A 6th circle shadow mage wouldn't attack head-on. Shadows are the weapon of an assassin, not a warrior. The strike would come silently, quickly, at the most unpredictable moment, and the target wouldn't be Dorian. The target would be one of those he was protecting. That was the logic of infrastructure destruction. Don't kill the leader, kill his people. Break his spirit. Dorian mentally checked their positions. Lyriel on the left, Yrith on the right. The rangers behind him. The wagon in the center. The cold spot was approaching. 20 meters. 18. 15. It was moving toward the wagon. No, past the wagon. Toward Lyriel. Lyriel was the most valuable target. The prince's wife. The heiress of Sarath. Her death would sever the alliance with House Sarath. It would deprive Dorian of his trade ties, and most importantly, it would destroy his first pact. The system confirmed it. The death of an ally would nullify the corresponding pact. The copied talent would be lost. All accumulated resonance points would be reset to 0. Dorian clenched his teeth. 12 meters. The shadow glided along the edge of the forest, soundless, tresidentless, invisible to any ordinary observer. 10 meters. Dorian acted. He didn't wait for an attack. He didn't create a protective barrier. He did something he'd only learned yesterday. After receiving the dragon's blood, his body generated heat, constantly. Excess heat that had previously been a useless side effect. Now it had become a weapon. Dorian released a wave of heat, directed, concentrated. Not fire, not a flame, just a sudden 30-degree rise in air temperature within a 15-meter radius, in a single second. The shadows vanished, all of them. Every shadow within the radius evaporated under the influence of the superheated air. Because shadows exist only where there is a contrast between light and darkness. Remove the contrast, and the shadows cease to exist. And the shadow mage hiding within them is left out in the open. Draven materialized 7 meters from Lyriel. Tall, thin, clad in black, his face hidden by a hood. In his right hand, a short blade made of dark metal. He stood completely exposed, ready to attack. No cover, no disguise, for the first time in a very long time. His eyes darted toward the source of heat, toward Dorian. There was astonishment in those eyes, pure, genuine astonishment. No one had ever lured him out of the shadows like this before. Draven was a professional. 3 seconds in the open meant mission failure. He turned to flee, but Dorian was faster. 9th circle physical strength, a body enhanced by dragon blood, a speed he hadn't possessed even yesterday. Dorian covered 7 meters in a fraction of a second. His right arm was covered in icy armor from his fingertips to his elbow. His fist slammed into Draven's chest with a force that made the air burst. Draven was sent flying backward. His body pierced the trunk of a young tree and came to a stop only after striking a boulder. The icy armor on Dorian's arm cracked and crumbled, but the blow had hit its mark. Draven lay by the rock. His ribs were broken, at least 4 of them. Every breath he took was accompanied by a wheeze. But he was alive, and he was dangerous. The shadow cast by the boulder began to envelop his body. He tried to slip away through the shadow again. Dorian didn't give him a chance. Icy shackles sprouted from the ground around Draven's arms and legs. At the same time, Dorian unleashed another heat wave. The shadows around the boulder dissolved. Draven was pinned to the ice and deprived of his only means of escape. He lay there, looking up at Dorian. His hood had slipped off. His face, about 35 years old, 3 scars in parallel lines on his right cheek, gray eyes with a yellowish tint, the eyes of a killer. Dorian crouched down beside him. He asked who had sent him. Draven remained silent. Dorian placed his palm on Draven's broken ribs. Ice began to form around his ribcage, slowly, in a thin layer. The pressure on each rib increased by a millimeter. Draven clenched his teeth. His face turned pale. When the pressure reached the point where the broken ribs began to shift, Draven spoke. Kael Vel, the 3rd prince. The mission? Destroy the 4th prince's infrastructure. Targets: allies, merchants, wife. Methods at the executor's discretion. Dorian withdrew his hand. The ice receded. He looked at Lyriel. She stood 3 steps away, white as snow, not from the cold, from the realization that this man had come to kill her. Irith stood beside her. Her fists were red hot. A dark red glow shone through her skin. She was ready to burn Draven on the spot. Dorian shook his head. A living assassin is more valuable than a dead one. He asked Draven how many more of Kael's men were in the eastern lands. Draven replied that he didn't know. He worked alone, always. But he knew that Kael had sent one more man, not an assassin. Smoke was rising from Verdon's warehouse, the leader of the 3 merchants who had defected to Dorian's side. When Dorian ran through the northern gate, the guards parted. They recognized him. But in their eyes, there was not respect, but confusion. A crowd had gathered in the market square, about 100 people. Soldiers from the garrison had cordoned off the burning warehouse, but weren't putting out the fire. They stood and watched. Among them, Dorian spotted Brogan. The old sergeant was pale. A fresh bruise darkened his cheekbone. Dorian approached him and asked what had happened. Brogan reported. 2 hours ago, a man had arrived in the city with a document bearing Chancellor Harwin's seal. The document declared that Administrator Dorian Vell had been temporarily suspended from office on suspicion of abuse of authority. All his orders were revoked. Maegor was reinstated as commandant until the investigation was complete. Maegor acted immediately. Within the first hour, he ordered his men to arrest 3 merchants who had sided with Dorian. Verdon resisted. His warehouse was set on fire. Verdon himself was thrown into the city jail. The other 2 merchants were locked in their homes under guard. Brogan tried to intervene. 4 garrison soldiers loyal to Maegor beat him and took his weapon. Garen and his men were outside the city on the highway. They didn't know what was happening. Dorian listened. His expression didn't change, but the air around him grew colder with every passing second. The people standing closest to him began to back away. They didn't understand why. They simply felt that it had become very cold near this man. Dorian asked where Maegor was. Brogan said he was at the barracks, with the negotiator, Kael, and with a dozen of his own men. Dorian headed for the barracks. Brogan followed him. 4 soldiers loyal to Dorian joined them in silence. 6 of Maegor's soldiers were standing at the barracks entrance. They blocked the way. The senior-most among them said that, by order of the commandant, the suspended administrator was forbidden from entering the barracks. Dorian stopped in front of them. He looked at each one in turn. 6 pairs of eyes. 4 showed fear. 2 showed determination. Those 2 had been Maegor's men from the very beginning. The other 4 were simply soldiers following orders because they didn't know whose orders were correct. Dorian didn't fight them. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The air temperature within a 20-meter radius dropped to 0. Instantly. The 6 soldiers' breath turned into white clouds. A thin crust of frost formed on the armor froze into a thin crust. The hilts of their swords were covered in frost. Their fingers went numb. It wasn't an attack. It was a demonstration. Dorian was saying he was coming in, that those who wanted to stop him could try. The 4 soldiers stepped aside. 2 of Maegor's loyalists remained. One of them reached for his sword. His fingers froze to the hilt. He jerked his hand away, tearing the skin from his palm. The blood froze instantly on the metal. He stepped back. Dorian entered the barracks. It was warm inside. The fireplace was burning. Maegor was sitting at the table. Standing next to him was a man Dorian had never seen before. Short, a bit on the heavy side, dressed like a capital official. The Chancellor's seal on his belt. A Kael negotiator. His name was Tesseren. And he wasn't an official. He was a Kael agent using a forged Chancellor's seal. But Dorian didn't know that yet. Tesseren looked at Dorian and smiled. A professional smile. Well rehearsed. He said that Prince Vell must understand that his authority had been suspended, that any resistance would be classified as mutiny. that the best thing he could do was return to the capital voluntarily and explain himself to the Chancellor in person. Dorian looked at the document lying on the table. The Chancellor's seal. Harwin's signature. Paper with treasury watermarks. Everything looked genuine. Dorian picked up the document and examined it. 30 seconds. Then he put it back on the table. He said the document was a forgery. Tesseren didn't flinch. He asked on what grounds the prince was making such a claim. Dorian replied, "Chancellor Harwin's seal has a defect, a small chip in the lower left corner of the coat of arms. That chip appeared 3 years ago when the seal fell off the table. Harwin didn't replace the seal because he considered the defect useful. It allowed one to distinguish a genuine seal from a forgery. There is no chip on this document. The seal is perfect. Too perfect." Tesseren was silent for 5 seconds. His smile remained unchanged, but his eyes had changed. The mask of the official began to crack. Maegor sat at the table, shifting his gaze between Tesseren and Dorian. He was unaware of the defect in the seal. He had accepted the document as genuine. He had acted on the basis of a paper that turned out to be a forgery. Dorian turned to Maegor. He said that the former commandant had just committed an act of insubordination. He had arrested subjects of the crown. He had destroyed a merchant's property. He had used force against the governor's soldiers, all on the basis of a forged document. He said that even if Maegor had acted out of ignorance, that did not absolve him of responsibility. But Dorian was willing to show mercy if Maegor named, right now, the person behind this scheme. Not Tesseren, not the negotiator. The one who pays, the one who controls the other 6 cities. Maegor looked at Tesseren. Tesseren shook his head, barely noticeably. Maegor looked at Dorian. He pressed his lips together. Then he parted them. He named the man. Kael Vel, the 3rd prince. Tesseren closed his eyes. His hand slid toward his belt. A short knife. Not for Dorian, for Maegor. A dead witness doesn't testify. The movement was swift, professional, but Dorian was faster. An icy glove formed around Tesseren's hand a split second before the dagger left its sheath. The agent's fingers froze solid. The dagger remained in its sheath. Tesseren clenched his teeth against the pain. His hand was encased in ice from his fingertips to his wrist. Dorian stepped right up close to him. He said quietly that Tesseren would now tell him everything he knew about Kael's network. Every city, every commander, every merchant, every route, every number. Or his hand would remain frozen until his fingers turned black and fell off. Tesseren was an agent, not a fanatic. He knew Kael wouldn't send anyone to rescue him. He knew his value to Kael had ended the moment Maegor had named the person. He began to speak. Everything. 7 cities, names, amounts, smuggling routes, money laundering schemes, connections in the capital, 12 merchants who funneled money through fictitious shipments, 4 gangs that operated on his orders. And one detail Dorian hadn't expected. Chancellor Harwin knew everything. He didn't work for Kael, but he received 5% of the total turnover for turning a blind eye. 5% of 20,000 is 1,000 gold pieces a year. For the Chancellor, that was pocket change. 3 days after the events in Tesseren, Lyriel and Irith arrived in Varath with the captive Draven. The city greeted them quietly. No celebrations, no commotion. People watched the 2 wagons entering through the northern gates and saw something new. The prince's 2 women. They knew one of them, Lyriel Sarath, pale, calm, as cold as her magic. The other they were seeing for the first time, Irith Calith, dark red-haired, vein-ridden, with amber eyes that made the air seem warmer. Dorian met them at the gate. He looked different. Over the past 3 days, his face had grown harder, not from fatigue, from the decisions he'd been making. Lyriel jumped down from the wagon and looked at him. She said she could tell he hadn't slept. Dorian replied that there had been no time to sleep. He told both women about Tesseren, about the Kale Network, about the forged document, about the 7 cities. They listened in silence. When he finished, Irith spoke first. She said that the 7 cities meant 7 commanders loyal to Kale. If Dorian wanted to destroy the network, he would have to take those cities one by one. Lyriel shook her head. She said it would take a long time, and it was dangerous. Every city was a potential battle. Every commander had people and resources. Kale would find out after the very first city and take action. Dorian nodded. He said he wasn't going to take the 7 cities by force. He was going to take them with paperwork. Both women looked at him. Dorian explained. He had Tesseren's full testimony. Names, amounts, routes, diagrams. That was enough for Chancellor Harwin to launch an investigation. Harwin is 5% involved, but Harwin is, first and foremost, a bureaucrat. If presented with evidence that Kale is stealing 20,000 from the crown each year, Harwin will quickly conclude that it's easier to betray Kale than to risk his own head for 1,000 gold pieces. For Harwin, it's arithmetic, not morality. Lyriel understood. She said that Dorian wanted to use the Chancellor as a weapon against Kale, to make the system work against the very person who created it. Dorian nodded. But to do that, he needed leverage, evidence from the Chancellor's agent who had traveled with the caravan to Verath. That agent was still in the city. He would pass the information directly to Harwin, bypassing Kale, bypassing Renval. Only Harwin. Dorian summoned the Chancellor's agent that very evening. The agent arrived. He looked nervous. Over the past few weeks, he had seen Dorian defeat Garen's gang. He had seen him oust Magor. He had seen him expose the forged seal. The agent no longer considered this young man a harmless subject of surveillance. Dorian placed a folder on the table. Inside were Tesseren's written testimony, a copy of the forged document, and merchants' records confirming the amounts stolen, the names of the 6 remaining commandants in Kale's network, and a single line at the bottom of the last page. Chancellor Harwin receives 1,000 gold pieces a year for doing nothing. The agent read it. His expression changed with every page. By the time he reached the end of the folder, his hands were trembling. It was a bombshell. Not a physical one, a political one. Powerful enough to destroy the Third Prince's career, and dangerous enough to destroy anyone who delivered it. Dorian said that the agent would deliver the folder to Chancellor Harwin personally, that Dorian demanded nothing in return except one thing. Harwin must launch an investigation, an official one, with royal authorization. If he didn't, Dorian would send a copy of the folder directly to the king through other channels. The agent asked which channels. Dorian replied that it was none of his business. The agent nodded. He took the folder and left. He left Verath the next morning. Dorian didn't know if the information would reach Harwin. He didn't know if the agent would betray him or carry out the assignment, but he had done everything he could on that front. Now he had to move on to the next thing, the House of Arenthis. Dorian had found information about them in Tesseren's records. The House of Arenthis was small, not a military house, not a merchant house, an advisory house. The head of the House of Arenthis, named Kael'din, had served as an advisor at the court of Ashenmoor 20 years ago. He then retired and settled on a small estate south of Verath. His daughter, Shale Arenthis, 19 years old, third circle, talent, third eye. The ability to see mana flows and predict the actions of any creature within a 50-meter radius 3 seconds before they occur. 3 seconds. In battle, 3 seconds is an eternity. With this gift, Dorian could see every move his opponent made before it happened. Every attack, every feint, every attempt to escape. The 4-fold multiplier from the third circle gave the equivalent of the 12th. But Dorian understood that the third eye worked differently than combat magic. Its effectiveness isn't measured in circles. It's measured by range and prediction accuracy. A four-fold boost would mean a range of 200 meters and a 12-second prediction window. That would make Dorian practically invulnerable in combat. But there was a problem. Caeldon Arenthis wasn't a wronged aristocrat in need of protection. He was a former advisor to the king, intelligent, cautious, and reserved. He did not receive guests. He did not seek allies. He did not need money. His estate was modest but self-sufficient, a small farm, a few servants, a wall, and a moat. Dorian couldn't offer him protection because Caeldon didn't feel threatened. He couldn't offer money because Caeldon didn't need it. He couldn't offer political influence because Caeldon had deliberately rejected it. What could Dorian offer a man who needed nothing? Lyriel provided the answer. She said that Caeldon had resigned from his post as advisor 20 years ago. She asked why. Dorian didn't know. Lyriel said she had found a reference to it in the archives of House Sarath. Caeldon Arenthis resigned after his wife's death. She died under circumstances that were never publicly explained. The official version? An accident. Unofficially, rumors circulated that she had been murdered on the orders of someone at court. Caeldon could not prove it. He could not get an investigation underway. And he left. Not because he was tired, but because the system he worked within had betrayed him. Dorian listened. Then he asked who was suspected. Lyriel replied that rumors pointed to the then commander of the Valhorn border fortress, a man named Drathek. Dorian knew that name. Drathek had been mentioned in Tesseren's testimony. He was one of the key figures in Kael's network. The commander of Valhorn Fortress controlled the military contingent on the eastern border. He ensured the security of Kael's smuggling routes in exchange for a share of the profits. Dorian closed his eyes for a second. The connections were coming together. 20 years ago, Drathek killed the wife of advisor Arenthis, probably on orders from someone at court, perhaps to eliminate a man who knew too much. Caeldon was unable to secure justice and left. Now Drathek works for Kael, and Dorian is preparing to destroy Kael's network. If Dorian can provide Caeldon with evidence of Drathek's involvement in his wife's death, it won't be about money, not protection, not power. It will be justice. The one thing Caeldon Arenthis had wanted for 20 years. Dorian opened his eyes. He looked at Lyriel, then at Irith. He said they needed to visit the Arenthis residence, but first he needed evidence. Concrete evidence. Irrefutable evidence. The kind that would convince the king's former advisor. Dorian returned to Tesseren. The captured agent was sitting in a cell at the city jail. His fingers had healed. The bluish tint was gone. He was eating and drinking. He wasn't trying to escape. He had nowhere to run. Dorian asked him about Drathek. Tesseren knew a little. Drathek was a tough military man, 7th Circle. He had commanded Valhorn Fortress for the last 25 years. He had worked for Kael for the last 15. He was the most dangerous element in the network. Not because he was the most cunning, but because he had an army. 300 soldiers at Valhorn Fortress. Of those, 50 were from the 3rd Circle and 10 from the 4th. Dorian asked about Caeldon Arenthis's wife. Tesseren frowned. He said he'd heard an old story. 20 years ago, Caeldon discovered that contraband was being smuggled through Valhorn. He launched an investigation. His wife was killed a week after he submitted his report to the king. The report disappeared. The investigation was closed. Caeldon left. Dorian asked if there were any documents. Tesseren said that all documents were kept in the Valhorn Fortress archives. If Caeldon's report had existed, a copy might be there. Drathek didn't destroy the papers. He kept them as insurance, as leverage, as a weapon in case any of his patrons decided to get rid of him. The Valhorn Fortress Archives, 300 soldiers, the commander of the Seventh Circle. This wasn't a visit. It was a military operation. Dorian couldn't storm the fortress, not now, but he could sneak inside, alone, quickly, at night, with icy perception to detect the guards, with dragon blood for speed and endurance, and with ice magic to clear obstacles. Lyriel said it was madness. Irith said she was going with him. Dorian looked at both of them. He said that Lyriel was right. It was madness, and that Irith would stay behind, because if he didn't return, someone had to hold Verath. Irith clenched her fists. The heat around her intensified. She said she wasn't used to waiting. Dorian replied that getting used to it wasn't necessary. It was enough to just do it. Irith exhaled. The resonance with Irith increased by 4 points, 18 out of 50. Dorian left Verath at midnight, alone, dressed in dark clothing, unarmed. It was 60 kilometers to Valhorn Fortress. At his pace, that was 4 hours of non-stop running. He reached Valhorn before dawn. The fortress stood on a rocky ledge above a gorge, massive walls of gray stone, 4 towers, gates made of ironwood, torches on the walls, patrols every 15 minutes. Dorian lay down on the hilltop, 300 meters from the wall. His icy perception reached out toward the fortress. 310 meters wasn't enough. He concentrated. The dragon's blood enhanced his physical abilities, including his concentration. He pushed his perception further. 40 meters, 50. At his limit, he reached 60. That was enough to sense the patrols on the nearest wall. He waited. He studied the rhythm of the patrols. He counted the intervals. He looked for blind spots. After 2 hours, he found one. The southeast corner. There was a 40-second gap between patrol shifts during which this section of the wall remained unguarded. 40 seconds. For an ordinary person, that wouldn't even be enough time to run to the wall. For Dorian, with his 9th circle of physical strength, it was an eternity. He surged forward, 300 meters in 12 seconds. An 8-meter-high wall. Icy spikes sprouted from the stone beneath his feet, forming steps. 3 seconds. He was at the top. The icy steps melted away behind him 4 seconds later. No traces. Inside the fortress, Dorian moved like a shadow. Not a magical one, just a regular one. He hugged the walls. He used the blind spots between the torches. His icy perception warned him of every patrolman 60 meters away. The archive was located in the basement of the central tower. He knew this from Tesseren's testimony. The archive door was locked. An ordinary iron lock. Dorian filled the keyhole with water from the air and froze it. The expanding ice broke the mechanism from the inside. A quiet click. The door opened. Inside were shelves. The Orenthus estate stood 2 days' journey south of Verath. It was small, a stone house on a hill, a wall 2 human heights high, a moat filled with water, a garden within the perimeter. Nothing ostentatious, nothing superfluous. The home of a man who did not wish to attract attention. Dorian had arrived with Lyriel. Irith had remained in Verath to command the defenses. The 2-day journey had given Dorian time to think. He was in no hurry. Kaeldin Orenthus was not the sort of man who could be impressed by a display of power or bought off with promises. The king's former advisor had seen enough promises in his lifetime not to believe a single one. A servant met them at the estate's gate. An elderly man, a man of few words. He looked at Dorian and then at Lyriel. Then he said that the master did not receive guests. Dorian replied that he was not a guest. He was the 4th prince of Ashenmoor and the governor of the Eastern Corridor. He had information that concerned the master personally. The servant went inside. He returned 10 minutes later. He said that the master would receive the prince alone, without his companion. Lyriel looked at Dorian. He nodded to her and went in alone. Kael'dan Orenthus was sitting in the library. It was a small room. 3 walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling. 1 window, 1 chair, 1 table. On the table was a cup of cold tea and an open book. Kael'dan was about 60, thin, gray hair down to his shoulders, dark eyes, deep set. The eyes of a man who had long observed things that others preferred to ignore. He didn't stand up when Dorian entered. He looked at him and said he'd heard about the 4th prince, about how a boy without magic had suddenly gained power, about how he'd taken Varath from Magor, about how he'd subdued Garen's gang. Rumors reach even those who don't want to hear them. Dorian sat down across from him. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He placed the folder on the table. 3 documents from the Valhorn Fortress archives. Kael'dan looked at the folder, then at Dorian. His expression didn't change, but his hand, as it reached for the folder, trembled slightly. He opened the first document, his own report from 20 years ago. The signature he'd affixed in the Royal Council chamber, a seal that had still meant something back then. He read slowly, though he surely remembered every word. He moved on to the second document, Drathek's order to eliminate the problem with the advisor's family. Kael'dan's hand paused. He reread the line, then once more. Then he closed his eyes. He sat with his eyes closed for 30 seconds. When he opened them, they were dry, but something in them had changed. Something that had been frozen 20 years ago had begun to thaw. He read the third document, a report on the operation, an accident, a carriage, a ravine. The investigation was closed. Kael'dan neatly folded all 3 documents back into the folder. He placed his hands on the table. His fingers were interlaced. His knuckles were white. He asked where Dorian had found it. Dorian replied, "The Valhorn Fortress archives. Drathek had kept the documents as insurance." Kael'dan nodded. He said he knew, that he'd always suspected Drathek, that he'd lived with that suspicion for 20 years without a shred of evidence. He asked what Dorian wanted in return. Dorian didn't lie. He said he wanted an alliance between the House of Orenthus and the House of Vel, sealed by marriage to Kael'dan's daughter. He said he needed the gift of foresight, that a war with the 3rd Prince of Kael lay ahead, that Drathek was one of Kael's key figures, and that if Kael'dan wanted justice, the only path to it lay through the destruction of the network that had been protecting Drathek for 20 years. Kael'dan was silent for a long time. Then he asked what would happen to Drathek. Dorian replied that Drathek would be put on trial, publicly, with the evidence presented, in the presence of the king, or he would be dead, depending on which option proved possible. Kael'dan looked at Dorian. He said he wanted to speak with his daughter, alone, without anyone else present. Dorian stood up and left. He waited in the garden for 2 hours. Lyriel sat next to him on a stone bench. She didn't ask any questions. 2 hours later, Shale Orenthus came out of the house. Dorian saw her for the first time. Tall, slender, dark hair pulled back in a braid. Her face was calm, almost expressionless, but her eyes were unusual, light gray, almost white. Her irises were so pale that it seemed as if she were looking through the world rather than at it, a third eye. Dorian could feel her gaze gliding over him, not over his body, but over his aura, the currents of power within him. She saw his ice magic, saw the dragon's blood, saw the 2 channels of his 2 copied talents. And she saw the empty channels, dozens of empty channels waiting to be filled. Shale stopped 5 steps away. She said she'd never seen anything like it, that his body was an empty library with endless shelves, and only 2 of them were occupied. Dorian nodded. That was an accurate description. Shael said her father had told her about the documents, about Drathek, about the proposal for an alliance. She said she agreed, not for her father's sake, not for the sake of justice, although that too. She agreed because, for the first time, she saw a person capable of using what she could see. The third eye had been a curse for her. She'd seen streams of mana since childhood. She'd seen lies. She'd seen intentions. She'd seen people's future movements 3 seconds before they happened. But she couldn't do anything about it. The third circle, too weak to act on what she saw. Information without power is torture. Dorian understood. He held out his hand. Shael looked at his palm, then at his face. She took his hand. The ceremony took place the next morning on the stone floor of the Orenthus estate. Blood on the stone. The third pact. The union system. The third pact is sealed. The Allies' talent is recognized. Third eye. Third circle. Cloning complete. Multiplier 4. Equivalent to the 12th circle. Mana perception radius 200 meters. Depth of action prediction 12 seconds. Warning. Full activation of the third eye requires nervous system adaptation. Adaptation period 72 hours. Dorian closed his eyes. When he opened them, the world looked different. He could see everything, not with his eyes, but with something else. Streams of mana coursing through the mansion's walls. The 3 days of adaptation were grueling. Dorian lay in a dark room at the Varath residence with his eyes closed. His third eye was working non-stop. Information poured in like a torrent. Every living creature within a 200-meter radius was generating data, movements, intentions, streams of mana, body temperature, heart rate. His brain was learning to filter this stream. On the first day, he couldn't stand up without feeling dizzy. On the second day, he learned to selectively shut off his perception, leaving only the immediate 30-meter radius active. On the third day, he went out onto the roof of the residence and activated the full range, 200 meters. The entire city of Varath fit within his perception. He could see every resident, every soldier, every merchant. He could see Brogan on the wall, Garen at the northern gate, Lyriel in the library, Irith on the training grounds, Shael in the garden. He saw a young Thane soldier practicing his sword strikes, the widow of a murdered merchant sweeping the porch, an old fisherman mending his net on the riverbank. 200 meters, 12 seconds of foresight. Now he was ready. That morning, 2 pieces of news arrived. The first was from Garen. His scouts on the highway reported that an official convoy was moving from the capital. 20 horsemen, the Chancellery's banners. They would arrive in 2 days. This meant that the agent had delivered the folder. Harwin reacted. The second piece of news came from Irith. Her father, Torvan, had sent a messenger from the Caliph estate. The messenger reported that Brennan, Torvan's eldest son, had left the estate 3 days ago, in secret, at night, taking with him 2 servants and a week's supply of provisions. Torvan did not know where he had gone, but Dorian knew. Brennan had hated him ever since the hunt for the Shellhorn, a hatred that burned brighter than a dragon's flame. The only person who could accept Brennan, with his resentment and his knowledge of Dorian, was Kale, or Drathek. Brennan could tell them about the Second Pact, about the dragon's blood, about Dorian's level of power, about the troop dispositions in Varath, about the weak spots. Dorian stood by the window and thought. 2 events. The Chancellor's convoy in 2 days. Brennan, who might already be with Drathek. Time was running out. He gathered everyone. Brogan, Garen, Lyriel, Irith, Shael. The 6 of them sat around the table in the residence's command room. Dorian laid out the situation. Harwin's convoy was a good sign. It meant the Chancellor had begun to act. But Harwin would proceed cautiously, slowly, bureaucratically. Investigations, interrogations, paperwork. Months of work. They didn't have months, because Brennan was already with the enemy, and Drothek, having learned of Dorian's strength, wouldn't wait for the Chancellor to reach him. Drothek would strike first. The commander of Valhorn Fortress with 300 soldiers. Irith asked how much time they had. Dorian replied that if Brennan reached Valhorn 2 days ago, and if Drothek decides to act quickly, the attack will come in 4 or 5 days, the time needed to assemble a detachment and march from Valhorn to Varath. Garen said his men were ready. 44 fighters. Not elite, but fighters nonetheless. Brogan reported that the Varath garrison was at full strength, 48 soldiers. Plus the 4 Lyriel brought from the capital. That makes about 100 fighters, against 300. Dorian shook his head. He said he wasn't going to defend Varath against 300 soldiers. He was going to prevent those 300 soldiers from reaching Varath. He laid out the plan. 3 stages. First, intercept the Chancellor's convoy, present Tesseran and Maegor's testimony to them, convince Harwin's representative to issue an official order to Drothek to appear immediately for questioning. Drothek will ignore the order, but this will give Dorian a legal basis for further action. His actions would cease to be an act of mutiny and would instead become the fulfillment of the Crown's will. Second stage. Intercept Drothek on the march. Not in a fortress where he holds all the advantages. In open terrain where speed and maneuverability matter more than numerical superiority. Stage 3. Dorian will personally challenge Drothek to a duel. Ashenmoor military court tradition allowed the accuser to demand the right of the sword. A duel before the ranks. The victor determines the loser's fate. If Dorian kills Drothek, his soldiers will be given a choice: submit or be declared mutineers. Without a commander, without orders, and without pay, most will choose submission. Lyria looked at him intently. She said the plan depended on a single assumption, that Dorian would defeat Drothek. The 7th Circle. 25 years of combat experience. A border fortress commander who had survived 3 wars and 2 coup attempts. Dorian replied that he was of the 8th Circle, with dragon blood of the 9th, and possessed the 3rd eye, which would reveal every one of Drothek's strikes 12 seconds before Drothek lands it. Lyriel didn't argue, but her eyes said she wished there were another way. The Chancellor's convoy arrived 2 days later, as expected. 20 horsemen. Leading the way was a man Dorian hadn't expected to see. Not an official, not an investigator, Chancellor Harwin himself. Harwin dismounted at the gates of Varath and looked out at the city. Then at Dorian, then back at the city. He said the place looked better than he'd expected. Dorian replied that expectations tend to be low. Harwin smiled. Not maliciously, appraisingly. They sat down at a table in the residence. Dorian placed a complete dossier in front of Harwin. Tesseran's testimony, Maegor's testimony, documents from the Valhorn archives, financial records, names, amounts, routes, and a separate line item. 1,000 gold pieces a year, 5%, Chancellor Harwin. Harwin read through the dossier. His expression remained unchanged. He was a professional. He showed no emotion, but his fingers, turning the pages, moved slightly faster than usual. When he reached the line about himself, he paused for 3 seconds. Then he turned the page and continued reading. When he finished, he closed the folder. He looked at Dorian. He asked what the prince wanted. Dorian replied, "An official investigation, royal authorization, Drothek's summons, and one unofficial condition. The line about 1,000 gold pieces must be removed from all copies of the dossier. Forever." Harwin stared at Dorian for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. He said the order would be signed today. Harwin took the seal out of his belt pouch. Dorian looked at it. A chip in the lower left corner of the coat of arms. Genuine. Harwin signed the order. A messenger carrying the document set off for Valhorn that very hour. Dorian knew that Drothek would ignore the order, but now he had the paper, the law, the formal right to act on behalf of the crown. Drothek received the order and tore it in half. The messenger saw it with his own eyes. He saw the fortress commander Valhorn read the document and toss the scraps into the fire. Then Drothek turned to his officers and gave the order. Full mobilization. 250 soldiers. 50 remain in the fortress. The rest march on Varath. The messenger fled that night. He reached Varath in a day and a half, having ridden 2 horses to exhaustion. His report was brief. 250 soldiers, a march through the foothills, arrival in 3 days. Dorian listened and nodded. 3 days. That was longer than he had expected. Drothek's march was not a swift one. It was a heavy march, with a supply train and siege equipment. The commander had no intention of merely punishing a rebellious boy. He intended to wipe Varath off the face of the earth. That was Drothek's mistake. A heavy march through the foothills, along the only road that wound through 3 narrow gorges. Dorian knew this road. He had studied the map during his first week in Varath. He chose the second gorge. The passage was 300 meters long. At its narrowest point, it was 8 meters wide. The walls were 30 meters high. An ideal spot for an ambush. The column of 250 men would stretch out here across the entire length of the gorge. The supply train would be stuck. Maneuvering would be impossible. Dorian had led 60 fighters out of Varath, 20 of Brogan's soldiers, the best of them, and 40 of Garen's fighters. The rest remained to defend the city under Irith's command. Lyriel stayed with her. Shael rode with Dorian. Her third eye was needed on the battlefield. Not for battle, for intelligence. Dorian positioned his men on the ridges of the gorge, 30 on each side. Rocks, tree trunks, prepared barricades, water barrels that Dorian had frozen into ice blocks weighing 300 pounds each. Garen commanded the left ridge, Brogan commanded the right. Dorian stood at the edge of the gorge and looked at the road leading into the foothills. Shael stood beside him. Her white eyes were half closed. She was scanning the areas. She said she sensed a column, a large number of people, 5 kilometers away, marching at a walking pace. They would arrive in an hour. Dorian nodded. He turned to Shael. He asked if she could see Drothek. Shael concentrated. At the limit of her perception, enhanced by the third eye, she detected a powerful stream of mana at the center of the column. The 7th circle. Earth and stone magic. Heavy. Dense. Like a block of granite. She said Drothek was in the middle of the column. Next to him was another powerful source of mana. Not the 7th. Lower. The 4th circle. Fire magic. Brennan. Dorian clenched his jaw. Brennan was marching with Drothek, the son of Torvan Calith, the traitor who sold information about Dorian to the enemy. If Irith found out that her brother was marching with an army intent on destroying her husband's city, the consequences would be unpredictable. But more on that later. For now, battle. The column entered the gorge 40 minutes later. The vanguard consisted of 20 scouts. The main body followed. The supply train brought up the rear. They stretched out over 250 meters. The vanguard commander passed Dorian's position without noticing anything. Dorian waited. Shael was counting. When the main column was fully inside the gorge and the supply train began to enter the passage, Shael touched Dorian's hand. She said that Drothek was in the center of the gorge, 140 meters from their position. Dorian stood up. He raised both hands, and he brought winter down upon the gorge. The temperature in the gorge plummeted by 40 degrees in 3 seconds. The air thickened from the sudden frost. The breath of 250 soldiers turned into white clouds. Their armor was covered in frost. Their fingers on their weapons went numb. At the same time, ice blocks on the ridges crashed down, 300 pounds of ice each. They didn't fall on the men, they fell on the road. In front of the vanguard, behind the supply train, 2 ice barriers blocked both exits from the gorge. Drothek's column was trapped. Garen and Brogan opened fire. Rocks and tree trunks rained down from the ridges onto the soldiers' heads. "Don't kill them," Dorian ordered clearly. "Crush them. Demoralize them. Don't let them regroup." Rocks and logs crashed down onto shields and helmets. The soldiers in the narrow gorge couldn't turn around. They couldn't form ranks. A stampede, panic, screams. Dorian leaped off the ridge, 30 meters down. His body, strengthened by dragon blood, absorbed the impact of the landing without a single fracture. The rock beneath his feet cracked from the force of the impact. He stood in the middle of the gorge. Before him were 250 soldiers, caught in chaos and the cold. His third eye showed him each one, every stream of mana, every intention. The 5 soldiers closest to him were preparing to attack. 4 seconds before the attack, Dorian saw their movements. He stepped to the left. The first blow missed. An icy palm struck a soldier in the chest and sent him flying 3 meters. The second swung his sword. Dorian saw the trajectory 7 seconds in advance. He intercepted the blade with his bare hand, covered in icy armor. The steel shattered from the cold. The third, a fourth, a fifth. Every strike was anticipated. Every counterattack was precise. Dorian moved through the gorge like a blizzard with a mind of its own. The soldiers fell, not dead, frozen, immobilized, shackled by ice around their arms and legs. Everyone he touched was covered in a thin layer of ice, paralyzing, but not lethal. He cut through 40 soldiers in 2 minutes, and then Drothek appeared before him, commander of Valhorn Fortress, tall, massive, dark iron armor, a face weathered like a rock, gray eyes, cruel. 25 years of war, 3 campaigns, 2 assassination attempts. The 7th circle, the magic of earth and stone. Standing beside Drothek was Brennan. His hands burned with a dark red fire, dragon fire. His eyes were filled with equal parts hatred and fear. Dorian stopped 10 paces away. He looked at Drothek, then at Brennan. He said that Brennan Calith could leave, right now. His father wouldn't find out, his sister wouldn't find out. Dorian would give him 1 chance. Brennan clenched his teeth. He replied that he'd rather die than accept mercy from a man who had stolen his inheritance. Dorian nodded. He didn't argue. He turned to Drothek. He said that Commander Drothek was accused of murdering the wife of Counselor Kael'dan Orenthis, of smuggling, of embezzling public funds, of treason against the crown. He said he demanded the right of the sword. A duel. Here, now. Drothek looked at the boy standing before him, at the scrawny prince who had just cut through 40 of his soldiers like a knife through butter. He was no fool. He saw the power. But he too was a force to be reckoned with. 25 years old, 7th circle, hundreds of battles. He wasn't afraid. He accepted the challenge. Brennan lunged forward against all logic. A torrent of dragonfire struck Dorian. Dorian didn't flinch. His third eye had predicted the attack 9 seconds earlier. He could have dodged it, but he chose otherwise. He stood his ground and took the fire to his chest. The dragon blood in his body absorbed the heat. The flames washed over him, causing no harm. His clothes smoldered. His skin was hot. But he stood there, unharmed. Brennan watched in sheer horror. his most powerful attack, a fourth circle dragon flame. It didn't even leave a burn mark. Dorian stepped toward him through the fire. One movement. An icy hand seized Brennan by the throat and lifted him into the air. It didn't squeeze. It didn't crush. It simply lifted him, as a reminder of the difference between them. Dorian told him that he was alive only because his sister, Irith, would have asked for it. Then he tossed Brennan into the snow and turned to Drothek. The commander attacked without warning. The ground beneath Dorian's feet exploded. Stone spikes burst from the soil like the teeth of a giant beast. The third eye predicted the attack 11 seconds in advance. Dorian stepped aside a split second before the spikes pierced the spot where he had been standing. Drothek didn't stop. His hands slammed into the gorge's wall. The rock responded. A boulder the size of a horse broke away from the wall and flew horizontally toward Dorian. Its speed was monstrous, the power of the seventh circle amplified by 25 years of practice. Dorian held out both hands. An icy barrier half a meter thick rose before him. The boulder struck the barrier. The barrier cracked, but it held. Shards of stone and ice scattered throughout the gorge. Dorian took a step back and rebuilt the barrier, but Drothek was already upon him. The commander moved quickly for a man of his size. His fist, encased in a stone gauntlet, flew toward Dorian's face. The third eye. 10 seconds. Dorian saw not only that blow, he saw the next three. A right fist to the face, a left elbow to the ribs, a knee to the stomach, a stone spike from beneath his foot into his thigh. 4 attacks, one combination, practiced to the point of second nature. Dorian dodged the first blow by leaning his torso to the side. He intercepted the elbow with his icy gauntlet. The stone crust on Drothek's elbow cracked from the cold. The commander yanked his arm back. His eyes widened. The cold seeped through the cracks in his stone armor. His joints began to slow. Drothek roared and slammed both hands into the ground. The gorge shook. A wave of stone shards flew in all directions across the floor. Dorian leaped. Dragon blood gave him a 4-meter jump. He hung in the air for a split second and brought an icy hammer down on Drothek from above, a concentrated pillar of ice as thick as an arm and weighing 200 pounds. Drothek took the blow with his forearms crossed and covered in stone armor. The stone held, but Drothek's knees sank 5 centimeters into the ground from the impact. Dorian landed and attacked again. Icy blades formed on his hands and shattered after each strike. His third eye allowed him to strike precisely at the gaps in Drothek's stone armor. Armpit, neck, knee, every blow found an unprotected spot. Drothek was retreating. For the first time in 25 years, the commander of Valhorn Fortress was retreating before his opponent in close combat. His stone armor was cracking from the cold. His joints were slowing down from the cold. Every strike of the icy blade left a deep cut that was immediately covered by a thin layer of ice, preventing the blood from flowing. Not out of mercy, the ice sealed the wound so that Drothek would not feel the loss of blood and fall into desperate rage before his time. Dorian controlled the fight, completely. His third eye tracked every movement. Dragon blood gave him speed and strength. Ice magic provided weapons and defense. The 3 talents worked as a single mechanism. Drothek realized this. He realized he was losing, and he did what all predators cornered do. He stopped defending himself. The stone armor dissolved and reabsorbed into his body. Drothek became lighter, faster. His eyes filled with blood. He poured all his remaining mana into a single attack. The ground within a 20-meter radius bucked. Stone pillars rose around Dorian like a cage. 10 pillars, each as thick as a man's arm span. They closed in, trying to crush him. The third eye predicted this 12 seconds in advance. the maximum prediction horizon. Dorian didn't dodge. He didn't break the pillars. He stood in the center of the stone cage, and when the pillars began to close in, he unleashed everything he had. Eighth circle ice magic, at full power, for the first time. The temperature inside the stone cage plummeted to -80 in a single second. Stone isn't designed for such temperatures. Granite becomes brittle in extreme cold. Its molecular structure breaks down. Micro cracks turn into fractures. The 10 stone pillars didn't close in. They shattered. The shards scattered through the gorge like shrapnel. Dorian stood in the center of a cloud of icy dust and stone debris, unharmed. Dragon's blood and icy armor had absorbed it all. Drothek stood 10 meters away. His arms hung at his sides. His mana was depleted. He had poured everything into that final attack, and it had failed. He looked at Dorian, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Not for his own life, for his legacy. For 25 years, he had built a fortress, an army, a reputation. For 25 years, he had been an impregnable wall, and now that wall had crumbled before a boy not yet 20. Dorian stepped toward him. 8 meters. 5. 3. He stood before Drothek and looked him in the eye. Dorian said that 20 years ago, Drothek had killed a woman, the wife of the man who had tried to stop the crime. Drothek didn't answer. Dorian pulled a document from his breast pocket, Drothek's order to eliminate him, his own handwriting, his own signature. He held up the document, not to Drothek, to the soldiers. 250 pairs of eyes were fixed on the paper in Dorian's hands. Those standing closer could see the commander's signature. Those standing farther away could see the reaction of those standing closer. And that was enough. Dorian declared that Commander Drothek was guilty, that the evidence would be handed over to the crown, that every soldier at Valhorn Fortress could choose to submit to the will of the crown and lay down their arms, or to share the commander's fate. Silence. A long, heavy silence in which every man in the gorge decided his own fate. The first to surrender was Drothek's deputy, a fifth circle officer named Hailgrim. He laid his sword on the ground and stepped back 3 paces. Behind him came the second officer, the third, the fourth. One by one, swords fell onto the rocks of the gorge. The clang of metal against stone sounded like the tolling of bells. 5 minutes later, 232 of the 250 soldiers had laid down their weapons. 18 of Drothek's most loyal men remained standing with their swords in hand. Dorian looked at them. He said he was giving them 10 seconds. After that, he would stop offering. 12 of the 18 dropped their weapons within the next 6 seconds. The remaining 6 rushed toward Drothek, trying to organize a defense. Dorian didn't budge. 6 icy needles formed in the air and struck each of them in the right shoulder simultaneously. Their sword-wielding arms gave out. Their weapons fell. The 6 collapsed to their knees. Drothek stood alone, without an army, without mana, without stone armor. An old commander, empty-handed and fully aware that his life was over. Dorian asked if he had any last words. Drothek looked at him. The journey to the capital took 9 days. Dorian led a column of 100 men, his soldiers, Garen's fighters, 30 volunteers from Drothek's former army who had pledged their service to the new commander. The captive Drothek rode in a barred wagon. The icy shackles on his hands were replaced every 6 hours. Brennan traveled separately, under the guard of 2 Garen warriors. He hadn't spoken a single word during the entire 9 days. Riding alongside Dorian were 3 women, Lyriel Sarath, Irith Caliph, and Shale Orenthis. 3 allies, 3 packs. 3 talents that had transformed an empty prince into a force to be reckoned with by an entire kingdom. Chancellor Harwin had gone on ahead. He had arrived in the capital 4 days earlier. Dorian knew why. Harwin was laying the groundwork. He would present the matter as if the investigation had been his initiative, as if he had uncovered Kale's network, as if Drothek's arrest were the Chancellery's achievement. Dorian didn't object. Let Harwin take the glory of being a bureaucrat. Dorian would take the result. On the 6th day of the journey, Shale approached Dorian. She had been riding silently beside him for half an hour. Then she said she sensed something ahead. Her third eye, set to maximum range, had detected a large cluster of mana streams 40 kilometers away, in the direction of the capital. Lots of people. Soldiers. Dorian wasn't surprised. He'd expected this. Renvale, the older brother, the heir to the throne, the 7th Circle, the only one of his brothers Dorian hadn't dealt with yet. On the 7th day, the column encountered Renvale's detachment. 50 royal guards, all 4th Circle and above. At the head was Renvale Vel, mounted on a warhorse, a scarlet mantle, the golden coat of arms of House Vel on his chest. Fire danced on his shoulders. Not for show, for battle. 7th Circle. Renvale reined in his horse 30 meters from Dorian's column. He looked at the younger brother he had sent to his death 3 months ago. A gaunt boy with empty channels. And standing before him was a man. Upright, broad-shouldered, with eyes in which a cold blue light burned. With 3 women behind him. With 100 fighters. With the captured commander of the fortress. And with an aura of power that made Renvale's warhorse shift nervously from hoof to hoof. Renvale said that his father had ordered him to escort his 4th son to the capital, for an inquiry. Dorian replied that he was glad to have an escort. Renvale did not smile. He looked at Dorian and tried to understand what he was seeing. His warrior's instincts told him one thing. This man is dangerous. His pride as an heir told him another. He is still a younger brother, still the 4th, still lower in the hierarchy. The 2 columns joined and set off for the capital. The last 2 days of the journey passed in silence. Renvale rode ahead, Dorian in the center. Between them lay 30 meters and a wall of pride that neither of them intended to break first. The capital of Ashenmoor came into view at dawn on the 10th day. White walls, towers of gray stone, the palace's golden spires. The city where Dorian had spent 16 years as a shadow. Like a mistake. Like a blank space in the family tree. He rode through the main gates for the first time. Before, he'd been taken through the side gates, not because it was a rule, but because it never occurred to anyone to let the 4th son through the main entrance. The streets were filled with people. Rumors of the events in the east had reached the capital. The story of a prince who had discovered magic, who had subdued the bandits, who had overthrown the commandant, who had crushed the army of Valhorn Fortress, who had taken the commander prisoner. People watched, most with curiosity, some with fear, a few with hope. The throne room. Dorian entered last. It was intentional. He gave Harwin time to present his report. He gave Renvale time to take his position. He gave his father time to prepare. King Ashenmoor sat on the throne, tall, lean, gray temples, eyes as cold as a mountain stream. He hadn't changed in 3 months. The same hands on the armrests, the same straight back, the same expressionless face. Renvale stood next to the throne, on the right, the heir's place. Kale stood on the left, the 3rd prince. Dorian saw him for the first time since his departure. Kale was calm, on the surface, but Dorian's 3rd eye saw his flow of mana, chaotic, unstable. Illusion magic pulsed beneath a control that was cracking at the seams. Kale knew he'd been caught. He knew that Dorian had brought Drothek, brought Tesseren, brought Magor, brought the documents. He knew that his network was destroyed. But he stood his ground because there was nowhere to run. Chancellor Harwin stood at the foot of the throne. He had already begun reading the report. Judging by the king's expression, the report was detailed. Dorian entered the hall and stopped 10 paces from the throne. Lyriel stood behind his right shoulder, Irith behind his left, Shale a step behind. 3 women, 3 allies, 3 sources of the power that flowed through the 4th prince's veins. The king looked at Dorian for a long time. He was silent. Then he spoke. He said he had received the Chancellor's report, that the charges against Kael Vel and Commander Drothek were serious, that the evidence was compelling, that an investigation would be conducted. Kael stepped forward. He said the charges were fabricated, that the 4th brother had acted out of self-interest, that he had seized Verath by force, that he had subjugated bandits, that he had formed illegal alliances, that he was a usurper and a rebel. His voice was steady. His arguments were logical. His illusion magic subtly colored every word, making it more convincing than it actually was. An ordinary person would have believed him. Dorian's third eye saw every impulse of the illusory magic. Thin threads of mana stretched from Kael to every person in the hall. They were not under his control. They were instilling trust, sympathy, agreement. A masterful work. Dorian spoke a single word. He told a lie. Then he raised his right hand. An icy wave swept through the hall. Not aggressive, not dangerous. Cold, clean air that washed away every thread of illusion, just as the wind blows away a spiderweb. Everyone in the hall felt it, as if a veil had fallen from their eyes, as if the thoughts of others, which had seemed like their own, suddenly felt foreign. The royal advisors exchanged glances. The guards blinked. Even the king shifted slightly on his throne. Kael turned pale. His threads had been shattered. His primary weapon had been neutralized, in public, before the entire court. Dorian had stated that the 3rd prince, Kael Vel, had just used illusion magic on the king and the courtiers, that everyone in this hall had felt an outside will attempting to override their judgment, that this, in and of itself, was proof. The silence in the hall was absolute. Kael stood as white as his shirt. His eyes darted about. He was looking for a way out. He found none. He turned to the king. He said it wasn't true, that his 4th brother himself was using unknown magic, that he was the most dangerous person in the room. The king raised his hand. Kael fell silent. The king stood up. He stepped down from the throne for the first time during the audience. He approached Dorian. He stopped 2 steps away and looked him in the eyes. Father and son, king and prince. 2 men who hadn't spoken to each other in 16 years. The king asked where his power came from. Dorian answered, simply, no beating around the bush. The Union system, the legacy of the first king, Aldrich Vel, an ancient power activated through a blood pact with an ally. Each wife's talent is replicated and amplified. His empty channels, which had been considered a curse, turned out to be the only condition for activating the system. Only a completely empty vessel can accept another's power without conflict. The king listened. His expression remained unchanged, but his eyes, something stirred in them. Not pride, not surprise, recognition, as if he had heard of this before, as if he knew it was possible. But he hadn't believed it until that moment. The king turned to the hall. He announced his decision. Kael Vel is stripped of all titles and offices. His property is to be confiscated. He will stand trial alongside Drothek. The commander of Valhorn Fortress is stripped of his rank and will be tried for murder and theft. An investigation across all 7 cities of the Eastern Route begins immediately. Control of the Eastern Territories is transferred to Dorian Vel with full authority, including military and judicial powers. Kale did not scream. He did not run away. He did not attack. He stood there and looked at Dorian. There was hatred in his eyes, pure, concentrated, like poison. But hatred without power is just a feeling. The guards approached him. He allowed himself to be led away, silently, with his back straight, maintaining a dignity that no longer mattered. Renville stood by the throne. He watched what was happening. His face was inscrutable. He did not defend Kale. He did not attack Dorian. He was weighing. He was assessing the balance of power, and he didn't like what he saw. In 3 months, his younger brother had gone from nothing to a power that surpassed everything in the kingdom. 3 wives, 3 talents, an army, territory, the chancellor's support, and an ancient system that had been the stuff of legends. Renville clenched his fists. A flame flared on his knuckles and immediately died out. Not here, not now, but someday. Dorian sensed it through his third eye. He saw Renville's flow of mana. He saw the tension. He saw an intention that had not yet taken shape as a plan. He knew that Renville would not accept this, but that was a problem for another day. That evening, Dorian stood on the balcony of the royal palace. The sunset bathed the capital's walls in gold and crimson. 3 women stood beside him. Lyriel was on his right. Irith was on his left. Shale stood a step behind him. Lyriel looked out at the city and said that it had all begun with a political marriage and a bloodstone in the palace basement. Irith said that nothing was over yet. Renville would not accept a secondary role. Shale remained silent. Her white eyes gazed toward the horizon. Through her third eye, she could see farther than the others. She saw streams of mana flowing throughout the city, thousands of people, thousands of stories, thousands of decisions yet to be made. Dorian stood and watched the sunset. The union system pulsed within him. 3 talents, 3 channels filled, dozens of empty ones awaited. Potential he had barely begun to unlock. 3 months ago, he was a nobody, an empty vessel, a mistake of nature, the dynasty's trash. Today, he ruled the Eastern Territories. He had destroyed the network that had been plundering the crown for 20 years. He had defeated the commander of the 7th Circle. He had exposed the prince before the king's very eyes, and he stood on the palace balcony from which even the servants had once been unable to see him. He thought of Caeldon Orenthus, who in a few days would stand before Drothek and finally hear the truth about his wife's death. He thought of Verdun, the merchant whose warehouse had been burned down and who would now receive compensation and a safe passage. He thought of Garin, who had gone from being a bandit to becoming commander of the trade routes guard and found more meaning in that than in 20 years of plundering. He thought of Brogan, the old sergeant who had seen in the kingdom's worst prince the best commander of his career. He thought of the city of Varath, which 3 months ago had been a dying trading hub and had now become the center of the new eastern province. Lyriel touched his hand. He turned to her. She said they would have a lot of work ahead of them, that 7 cities were waiting for a new order, that the Eastern Territories needed to be rebuilt, that the trials of Kale and Drothek would take months, that Renville wasn't going anywhere. Dorian nodded. There was plenty of work. There were no fewer enemies. The world hadn't become any simpler, but he was no longer an empty vessel waiting for someone else's decision. He was a man who made his own decisions, and standing beside him were 3 women who had chosen to be his allies. Not tools, not pawns in a political game. Allies. each with her own strength, each with her own story, each with her own choice. The system reported quietly. The combined resonance of all pacts had exceeded the 100-point mark. The second level of physical enhancement has been unlocked. A new ceiling has been reached, the 10th circle. Dorian felt a warm wave wash over him. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. The city below went about its business. Lights were coming on in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Somewhere, children were laughing. Somewhere, merchants were arguing. A typical evening in the capital. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. Dorian stepped back from the balcony railing. He looked at the three women. He told them that tomorrow they would return east to Varath, home.